Comics. Comics.
Welcome to another episode of ORP. For today's episode, Mike and I will be turning our attention back to The Dark Knight. While we've discussed Batman and his mythos in a previous episode, this time we'll be looking at his animated films. Specifically, we want to talk about our top 5 favorite Batman animated films. So, Mike, did you have anything you wanted to add to start us off?
I do actually. For this episode, Steve and I have talked about the animated Batman films that are out there and compiled a list of our favorites and chose our top 5 animated Batman films based on the ones that we agreed on. Those that were not chosen in the top 5 will be mentioned in the honorable mention section of the episode. But as is the case with all of our top 5 lists, these are just our opinions, and we do not claim to be the definitive answer to this question. Really, only you can do that for yourself. But we do hope to share our perspective and hopefully offer some food for thought about making your own top 5 list. And if you do, by the way, we would love to hear what your list is. So share that with us on Twitter, what you think. But now that we have the preliminary stuff out of the way, why don't we dive into the very first film, Steve?
Sure. First, though, I think Mike said it very well. We don't claim to present the definitive list, just the one that worked the best for us. But let's get on with it. The first film on our list is generally agreed to be one of the definitive Batman stories and certainly one of the best animated films. And that one is Batman Mask of the Phantasm, which was the DCAU's first foray into animated features. Mask of the Phantasm took significant influence from Batman Year 2 by Mike Barr and Alan Davis, but the writers ultimately decided to part ways from that story and go in their own direction with it. So the Reaper, who was the villain for Year 2, evolved into the Phantasm, who is honestly a much more compelling antagonist in this movie. Eventually, the Phantasm was adapted into the DC Comics universe, most recently in the Batman Catwoman limited series by Tom King and Clay Mann. So, Mike, did you have any opening thoughts on Mask of the Phantasm before we really get into it?
Just a few, but before I do, if I could comment a bit on what you said there, I feel like we should note the influence of Batman Year 1 on Mask of the Phantasm 2. The flashback to Batman's first night of crime finding with him wearing the black jacket and the black ski hat is parallel to the one in Year 1. Also, while it is not exact, the construction site scene where the wounded and beaten Batman has to escape the busted up building through trickery while the cops are looking for him also mirrors a similar sequence in Batman Year 1.
Awesome. I was really hoping you'd pick up on that. Yes, it's definitely true that Year 1 had an influence on Mask of the Phantasm as well. Between this and other films we'll discuss, I think it's safe to say that Frank Miller had a huge impact on Bruce Timm and the other DCAU creators. But I think you had a point you wanted to make about the Phantasm, Mike?
I do actually. Just as a quick side note, Mask of the Phantasm is not the last time we would see the Phantasm character in the DCAU. While the character is not named in Justice League Unlimited epilogue from 2005, the Phantasm was clearly shown stalking the McGinnis family in the flashback of Amanda Waller's story about sending an assassin to kill them. Plus, Amanda tries to hire the visibly aged Andrea Beaumont to kill Terry McGinnis, and she refuses to complete the assignment, citing Batman's refusal to resort to murder to achieve his goals and how doing so would dishonor what he stood for. Also, real quick, I love that Phantasm basically has Misty Step. I mean, they never say exactly how she's able to create and disappear into that fog, and she's able to do it at will, and it does kind of work like Misty Step. I mean, there's nothing to suggest magic, but there's also nothing to suggest tech in her suit to produce it, especially when she's able to just tear it off with one hand and it didn't have any weight to it at all.
That is an interesting take. Misty Step, for those who are not D&D players like ourselves, is a form of short-range teleportation. I never really saw what Phantasm does as a teleport trick, though I can totally see how people could see it that way. I just looked at it as kind of like Batman smoke bombs. I mean, she drops a cloud of smoke and uses it to disappear the way that Bruce does. It's theatricality combined with a trick that gives her the cover she needs to get away if she needs to. Now, if I were to use another D&D comparison, It's probably closer to the Cloak of Umberlee that we use in our campaign to create a cloud of fog, except hers isn't limited to nearby bodies of water.
I suppose you're right about that. I guess I was thinking about it purely in a visual sense with the Misty Step thing. I mean, I guess that's just how I picture it in my mind. But enough with the D&D talk. One of the reasons that I liked Batman the Animated Series back in the day was because it felt like the continuation of the world established in the 1989 film, which is really what made me a Batman fan. In particular, it was the theme music for the show. The soundtrack for the 1989 Batman film was done by Danny Elfman, but I would argue that Shuri Walker, who was the composer for both 1993's Mask of the Phantasm and 1992's Batman the Animated Series, really captured what Elfman was going for because it is a direct continuation of that score, at least to my ears. I mean, it takes me right back there. But it's not just that. Despite the artwork in this movie and in the animated series, which is a different style, they both visually captured Tim Burton's Batman with the lightning and the costumes and the architecture of the buildings and just the overall general darker take on Batman. What's more is that they expanded on it in ways that totally feel natural, like the police blimps around the city. Last but not least, Mask of the Phantasm makes nods to the 1989 Batman film, like Joker's entrance to meet Reeves at his office. That scene mirrors Joker's entrance to meet Carl Grissom, down to the Joker's outfit, even. All of that to say, I just really appreciate what this movie does and how they do it.
Oh, the same for me as well. That's a really cool connection, though, and I think you probably could easily headcanon the animated Batman as a continuation of the Burton movies if you really wanted to do that. I personally look at it a little differently, though. I always saw Batman the animated series as more of a spiritual successor to Burton and Keaton's Batman, while not necessarily being a direct follow-up. I mean, they definitely used elements of the Burton films. I mean, like the ones you mentioned. And Elfman's theme for the animated series is just perfect to use here. I think they definitely wanted to appeal to fans of the original Burton film, but they also drew more on the comics than Burton did. So the connection's definitely there, but I see it as more of a thematic one. As an aside, though, DC actually did a proper follow up to Burton's The Batman with the Batman '89 comic, which involves the Billy D. Williams version of Harvey Dent. So you may want to check that out if you're interested in more Batman '89.
I had totally forgotten about that Batman '89 trade, but I just put it on my list right now. I'm buying that son of a bitch. So thanks for the reminder. I do have to say very quickly though that I thought Billy D. Williams was the wrong choice for Harvey Dent. Uh, Williams in his younger days was quite possibly the coolest and smoothest dude I have ever seen. He just oozes suave and sexy. I mean, at least according to the women I have talked to who have seen Lady Sings the Blues. But that is just not how I would describe Harvey Dent. But I will just leave that there. As to the connections to the film and the animated series, I think you're probably right in that the connection to the 1989 Batman film is thematic for the most part. But there are some direct connections to the 1989 Batman movie in the Mask of the Phantasm and in the animated series. But I will get more into those in more detail later. For now, why don't we get back into talking about Mask of the Phantasm?
Sounds good to me. Although I will say briefly that Billy D. Williams, as much as I love him and as cool and awesome as he is as Lando Calrissian, just didn't quite hit the mark as Harvey Dent to me either. So, but we'll move on. Many people list Mask of the Phantasm as their favorite Batman movie, even over the live action films, and I honestly have to agree with that personally. This is easily my favorite Batman film to date. Yes, even over Pattinson. I think the reason that Mask of the Phantasm generally tends to rank so high is because it hits Batman's internal conflict in the way most Batman stories don't. I admit I'm generally not a fan of the idea, oh, Batman isn't allowed to find happiness and those kinds of stories because I just see that as a false choice built up for drama. It's a similar issue I have with Spider-Man, who also often gets this treatment as well. But I consider Mask of the Phantasm a well-written exception to that rule. Andrea Beaumont is designed to embody the choice between Batman's values and what he wishes he could have. She also represents what Batman might be if he crosses the line. So when tragedy strikes, it's not because Batman is choosing to be miserable. It's because Andrea gets caught up in circumstances beyond her control, and those circumstances change her into something that goes against what Batman believes in. So while Andrea could make Bruce Wayne happy, there's no way that she could satisfy Batman as long as the Phantasm exists. That's a great inner conflict, and it really works.
That is an excellent inner conflict for both them, and I will admit that I was surprised by the reveal that Phantasm was Andrea. I didn't know exactly who I thought it would be, but I definitely did not suspect her. But I do like the funny little lines in there when you rewatch it, and you know that she's Phantasm. Particularly the one where she tells Arthur Reese she has a killer day tomorrow. Writer Alan Burnett cited that he wanted to do a love story with Bruce because no one had really done that on the TV show. That he wanted a story that got into Bruce's head. So I think you were definitely picking up what they were putting down there, Steve. Overall, I'd say that Andrea was one of Bruce's better relationships for as long as it lasted. As for the film, Mask of the Phantasm is definitely up there for me as well. But honestly, I have a hard time nailing down a number one, as there are two others on our top 5 list that are vying for that spot as well. But we'll get into those as we come to them. I will say, though, that Mask of the Phantasm was the late Kevin Conroy's personal favorite Batman film, both of his work and just in general. It is also Robert Pattinson's favorite Batman film, and I gotta say I like that about him.
That is really cool, and it does give me more respect for Pattinson knowing that. Also, Conroy, before he died, did get the chance to do Pattinson's "Fear is a Tool" speech from the Batman before his unfortunate passing. So it's nice to see a mutual respect between the two there. But I'll be honest and admit that I didn't suspect Andrea at first either. By that time, I hadn't read Year Two, and I didn't know what they were going for. And by the way, the way they set the mystery up was really good. I honestly thought the Phantasm was going to turn out to be either Andrea's father or Arthur Reeves, and I was wrong on both counts. So good on the writers of this film. So there's some really good misdirection there. But I think a lot of it works because we don't want Andrea to be the Phantasm, because we love her and Bruce together so much in this movie. I mean, they both sell that relationship really well, and we see Andrea as someone who can give Bruce the happiness he's denied himself for so long. And then she turns out to really be the Phantasm, and all chance of happiness dies right there. It is a well executed tragedy.
I agree that this is a well done exception to the rule you mentioned earlier about not being a fan of the Batman isn't allowed to find happiness stories. It was less of a curse and more of a choice in Mask of the Phantasm, though. I have a counterpoint about that situation with both Batman and Spider-Man that I hope that can at least shed a different light on that for you. Um, do you remember that scene where Bruce is at his parents' tombstone talking to his parents' grave, and the storm and the
Mhm.
lightning is raging, and Bruce is trying to free himself of his vow, and Bruce says, "I didn't count on being happy." Well, first of all, I believe that storm represented what Bruce promised he would fight against, and it continuing as he asked to be released from his vow. The reminder that the evil in the heart of Gotham that he has sworn to fight rages on, even as he claims throwing money at the problem will be enough. The rain pouring down on him is his parents' answer. But more to my point, according to the writer Michael Reeves, this scene was to be a pivotal moment in Bruce's tragic life as he denies himself the opportunity to live a normal life. That is the noble sacrifice of Batman and Spider-Man. They give up love and happiness for the sake of others. While it makes their story basically a Greek tragedy, it also shows how much they are willing to sacrifice for others. And that, my friend, is laying down your life for your friends, or in this case, strangers. And there is no greater love than that. Granted, that concept is a bit more pure in Spider Man, but let me explain why with an example from Mask of the Phantasm. That scene at the graveyard ties directly into a scene where Bruce is in the cave with Alfred and he puts his mask on for the first time after Andrea had broken up their engagement. In Reeves' words, when Alfred says, "My God," he's reacting in horror because he's watching this man he helped raise from childhood, this man who has let the desire for vengeance and retribution consume his life, at last embrace the unspeakable. So that adds a level of self-destruction to it too. But my point about the sacrifice, I think, still remains. But what do you think about that, Steve?
Um, First, I would say I have a hard time believing that Bruce's parents wouldn't want him to be happy, but that's another point. I do understand though that this is what they're trying to go for, and as we see here, there are ways that it can work. It's the kind of thing that Stan Lee liked to do, where they put the hero's normal life as at odds with his life as a superhero. I mean, the idea is that the hero does make the noble sacrifice by choosing the costume over their chance at happiness. It's considered a tried and true technique in comics, so I totally get the point you're trying to make there. At the same time, I think my issue with this idea is that this trope is badly executed most of the time I see it now. Modern writers especially seem to botch these kinds of stories. There are plenty of instances where making the sacrifice isn't necessary, or there are clear third options where you can have both without having to lose anything, and the hero doesn't take them. So when the hero makes a sacrifice play when they don't need to, they just come across as stupid or self destructive, and this is especially true in Spider Man's case. And then you have other instances where the hero makes a sacrifice play to resolve a situation they have created. I'm looking at you here one more day in No Way Home. It's these kinds of scenarios that I've honestly gotten tired of. And while they may work for some people, for me, it's like nails going out on a chalkboard. I mean, sacrifice can be a noble thing. I mean, when it's truly the right and necessary play in that scenario. When it's not, I have to throw down the flag on that play because it's bad writing in my eyes. What makes Mask of the Phantasm so good is that the tragedy doesn't rely on any of that. This is really a necessary sacrifice. There is no way out of this, and no other choice that Batman can make here. Andrea has crossed the line, and as much as he loves her, he has to stop her from killing again. Andrea is not going to stop until she has her revenge, no matter who she has to kill to do it, as Bruce understands well. There is no way to talk her out of what she's doing, so it's Batman who has to sell the argument. And he has to do that because he loves her. He doesn't want her to keep going down the dark path. He wants to save her. But Bruce cannot have a life with Andrea as long as she continues on as the Phantasm. He couldn't live it with himself if he tried. He'd see it as betraying his parents' memory, and he would have a point there. In the end, Bruce makes the only choice he can make because he honors his parents and because he loves Andrea. Also, even though the story revolves around Bruce's past with Andrea, it's Andrea's past and her choices that creates a tragic outcome for them both. So when Bruce has to choose Batman, it's with a heavy heart that he does so, because he legitimately wants to find another way and he can't. The most he can do is let her go, which he ultimately does. I mean, this is a rare textbook example of how to do that kind of sacrifice well.
Uh, First off, I can totally see what you're saying about noble sacrifices in stories in general. They have to be done well, or they can really they really lose all their weight, and they can even taint a story or a character if with that moment. I will add, though, that there is a certain level of caution that needs to be taken on the part of the self sacrificing character in order to not put themselves in a compromising spot. Guardrails or even fences would have to be put up in order to not be put into a tempting situation that might cause them to stray from their vow. And perhaps that is why some of their sacrifices may appear to not be needed because they are precautionary. Like, I'm screwed if I cross that line. So, in order to not even come close to crossing that line, I'm going to draw a line far enough back from it that even if I do fall forward, I will never cross that initial line. In other words, a sacrifice might appear on its surface to be unnecessary or that there were other options available, but those options would cause those precautionary lines to be crossed and thus put the character closer or over that compromising position. But let's move on with the film. I believe there was another element in the film that you wanted to discuss, wasn't there, Steve?
I do, in fact. But to address your earlier point, there is merit to the idea that the best way to avoid a moral crisis like that is not to put yourself in that position in the first place. So I can respect that position. Of course, there are going to be times when that is unavoidable, even with the hero's best efforts. Speaking of which, let's get back to the Phantasm. I do really like that they build this mystery around the Phantasm and why the Phantasm is killing all these mobsters. Partly it's because this allows Batman to show his detective side more, and that's something that occasionally will be overlooked in Batman stories. But the mystery in this film was played well enough that I was surprised by the Phantasm's identity. There were a couple of really solid red herrings that might have worked, but at the same time, they do give you reasonable clues that add up in hindsight, like the Killer Day line. I know we've criticized The Long Halloween for its handling of the mystery elements, but I feel it worked a lot better here. Mike, did you have any thoughts on that?
It definitely worked better here, Steve, and I'll tell you why. At least as far as I see it, the Long Halloween posited a few possibilities for who the killer was, but never actually nailed down one. I suppose there is a place for those stories. I know there are some really big fans of the Long Halloween out there, like Omen Comics Vice President Tosin Awasika. That's actually his favorite Batman story. But while I like the mystery and the whole whodunit of it all, but I need the answers at the end, and that's where Mask of the Phantasm hits home. There is totally intriguing mystery throughout the film, and we've both expressed being surprised by the reveal. But you have to have that reveal. To leave it completely open ended might reflect what real life police and investigative work is like. But that's not what I want to see in a story, at least not as the main story. A detective can and should reference failures in the past, but the main story being told needs to have a resolution, in my opinion.
Agreed. I feel like they thought through everything that they were doing with the mystery. There are no moments where the writers are clearly thinking, "Oh my God, they're onto us, so let's flip the script." There's none of that. This one moves like clockwork, and they thought through all the angles in advance. Now, every so often, you get someone who wants to hunt down Batman, and we'll get into another example of that later in this list. But let's look at one of the red herrings, who is Reeves. Reeves comes across as first as someone who is zealously hunting Batman because he's a vigilante. But I think it's likely more than that, especially when we learn about his connection with Andrea's father and the mobsters he was involved with. I can't help but wonder if Reeves is afraid of Batman getting too close to his own business, and so he decided to shut down Batman before his mob connections became known. It could be political in other ways too, but I think that's probably the main reason.
I definitely got the ulterior motive vibe from Reeves when Commissioner Gordon full on backs out and called his evidence a sham. It really felt like he was grasping at straws to try and pin those murders on Batman, which also led to that ulterior motive feeling. So I think you're dead on there, Steve, especially with Joker's words to Reeves. A guy like you could find it awkward if certain secrets were revealed about his past. I think he was most certainly trying to cover his ass. If it had been a political, I think there would have been an addition to his speech at the beginning to the press about how his campaign or his office was going to do something. But that's just me.
Yeah, I think we're agreed there. So let's move on to our last major player in this drama. I make no secret that I dislike the Joker in most of his portrayals. However, if you're going to use the Joker, this movie shows the right way to do it. I think what I love about Joker and Mask of the Phantasm is that the movie is not about him. It's about the relationship between Bruce and Andrea, and Joker is an obstacle between them. By inserting the Joker into Andrea's past in a small role, it brings him into the story in the present, and that really works. On top of that, Joker's presence reminds Bruce why Batman is necessary in a way that most villains can't. So you do really need him here. Also, Mark Hamill's just great in this, and he gets some really cool moments, especially towards the end. What he does to Arthur Reeves is positively chilling, and it's Joker at his creepiest. But Joker doesn't dominate the movie. He just comes on when he needs to, he has impact at the right times, and he doesn't overstay his welcome and he gets out. But I know you're the real Joker fan among us, Mike, so what did you think of him in this film?
Well, a couple of things, but I have to start out by saying how awesome it is that we finally come across a story with the Joker in it that you like. I feel like I want to applaud or something. But you're right about how he was used in the Mask of the Phantasm. He was not the primary villain of the story, but served as part of the primary point of the story. And I can see what you mean about how he really works in that capacity. But I'm not sure his role in Andrea's life was a small one. At the very least, being the one who killed her father all those years ago makes his role significant. But let me elaborate on that in a roundabout way by starting out by saying the Joker is quite the detective in this story.
You have to learn a few things about detective work when Batman is your nemesis. I do agree that Joker becomes a major figure in Andrea's life in the relatively little time he has on screen. That's honestly one of the reasons I like him in this. He has a huge impact in a relatively smaller role. But I think you had another point about Joker that you're dying to make, Mike. Am I right?
I most certainly do, Steve. And this is actually the bit I was talking about earlier in regards to the connections between Mask of the Phantasm, Batman the Animated Series, and the 1989 Batman film. When the Joker confronts Reeves in his office, he clearly references his days as Jack Napier, as a gangster among the guys that Phantasm is taking out, even though the name Jack Napier is not mentioned. I know that he is Jack Napier, however, because as we talked about earlier, Batman the Animated Series is set in the same universe as the 1989 Batman film, a primary reason why I loved it so much. Plus, the movie and Batman clearly point to that specific gangster from the flashbacks as becoming the Joker, and that fits the movie. What's more is that even the Batman in the Animated Series wiki says that the character is Jack Napier in both Mask of the Phantasm and in the animated series. I guess I just like that. The 1989 Batman film is ambiguous as to whether Joker actually died at the end. It is at least implied that because of the voice box, the person that we thought was Joker was an imposter using a voice box to sell his act. I am torn on that theory, as I can see Joker having 2 points of view, both wanting to be there in person for that confrontation with Batman and sending a double to die in his place, like he has done with Clayface before, and like the Arkham video game. And I think Batman the Animated Series and Mask of the Phantasm pick up on that ambiguity with his presence in them. But in the Mask of the Phantasm, we get to see more of what he was like as a gangster. Last but not least, while the episode itself was scrapped for fear of crossing censorship lines, there was an episode for Batman the Animated Series called The Life of a Gun that would have more closely aligned itself with the 1989 Batman film by retelling Joker and Batman's origin stories through the telling of the history of the gun that killed Thomas and Martha Wayne. What's more is that there is a reference to that unmade episode in Mask of the Phantasm. The scene where Valestra puts his hands on Joker and Joker freaks out and the screen behind him turns all red, evoking an erupting rage, is a direct reference to a key moment in the animated series version of the Joker's origin story, where he had the exact same response when Batman put his hands on him. In that episode, like in the movie, a young Jack Napier killed Bruce's parents, and Bruce was so traumatized that he couldn't remember the killer's face, only the side of the gun. In that episode, Napier was attempting to reclaim the gun that he used the night at the Monarch Card Company rather than Axis Chemicals like in the movie. But as if by fate, Jack Napier has his first battle with the now grown-up boy as Batman. The connection I mentioned earlier about Joker not liking to be touched happens when Napier lashed out when Batman grabbed him, and that caused him to fall into the chemical vat. The episode was scrapped before it could begin production due to the network becoming uncomfortable with a scene in the episode in which the gun ends up in the hands of a young boy, particularly because the boy believed that the gun wasn't loaded and almost shot his brother while they were playing cops and robbers.
I said when we talked about the Batman '89 connections before, I see them mostly as thematic rather than an attempt at a direct tie-in. That said, this is a really cool theory. But I'm not completely convinced that the Joker here we see here is necessarily Jack Napier, especially since Jack Napier looked pretty convincingly dead in the '89 movie. And I know that you've really done your work and tried to explain how it could be possible. So I'm not saying that you're wrong here either, to make it clear. As far as I know, we don't have any evidence that Mark Hamill's Joker was not intended to be Napier, so that degree of ambiguity gives you plenty of room to interpret things. I do agree that Joker, having been part of Valestra's mob, led some credence to the idea, as well as the scene that you pointed out. Also, I don't remember the Joker's real name ever being mentioned in the DCAU, so I see no reason why Hamill's version couldn't be Jack Napier, especially since there is that spiritual tie-in between the Burton film and the animated Joker. I don't know that I read it that way, but honestly, if you really want to headcanon them as the same person, I say go for it. I mean, you'd have to, deal with that explanation for Joker's death in '89, but if you come up with a good explanation for why he's alive and all that, why not?
Even back in 1989 and the years that followed, there was a discussion, at least between my dad and I, about the voice box being a clue that he might be, and it seems to fit nicely into how I picture it all. But let's move on to a specific scene I would like to discuss. The scene where Joker confronts Reeves in his office suggests that they both knew a great deal about the Beaumonts, especially with Joker reminding Reeves of him and as Jack Napier and Saul the Weezer Valestra. Of course, Reeves denies this connection and claims to have only worked for the Beaumonts, and he's technically not lying. All he did was sell Carl Beaumont to the mob. So Joker thinking that Reeves was trying to protect his political position makes sense. But I think that the Joker put the pieces together about who the Phantasm was during that confrontation when Andrea called. Like he said, they were just talking about Carl and his daughter calls. But the Joker saying, "Oh, you devil," is where the pieces connected for him, I think. I say that because the Joker tries to kill Andrea with a booby trap phone call. Granted, it's Batman who's caught in the trap, as he too is suspecting Andrea. But Joker calling his intended target Toots and Boopsie suggests that the trap was really for Andrea. The reason that Joker knew all along that Phantasm was not in fact Carl Beaumont is that the Joker was the one to kill him all those years ago.
Very likely that is the case. It gives more of a punch to the ending as well if Joker is the one who pulled the trigger. But to get back to your point on the detective work he does, I like that Joker immediately discounts the theory that Batman had started gunning after the mobsters, And it makes total sense that he would. I mean, Joker might be insane, but he also knows Batman better than most people. That's the moment that sets the wheels turning in Joker's head more than anything. I'll also add that villains need to stop going to the Joker thinking yeah, he'll save them, because the vast majority of the time, Joker is the one who gets them in the end. As, but as far as Batman animated films go, I mean, I think this movie is probably as good as it gets, and it still holds up pretty well. It has Kevin Conroy and Mark Hamill at their best as Batman and Joker. Intriguing mystery villain, a love interest that introduces some real complications, and a story that hits the core of who Batman is as a character. Even the version of the opening theme just hits harder in this movie. But did you have any other thoughts on Mask of the Phantasm before we move on, Mike?
I do have some final thoughts on the film, Steve. However, I want to bring up a couple of things before I get into those final thoughts. And the first couple of them are about the Joker. In the movie, what happens to the Joker is not addressed, nor is it brought up in later episodes of the animated series. However, it was revealed in a DCAU comic called Shadow of the Phantasm, written by the film co-writer Paul Dini. In that comic, we see that Andrea found the Joker and took him down into the sewers and beat him viciously and nigh unto death. But when it came to actually killing him, Andrea hesitated because she realized that the Joker had become so twisted and insane that he was no longer the man who had murdered her father. At that moment, they are separated by a series of explosions, and Joker is knocked into the water and is carried away by the current. Also, as a quick side note, that same comic also reveals the fate of Arthur Reeves. Apparently, he does not die from the laughing gas, but he is utterly ruined by his connection to the mob in his crusade against Batman. Ultimately, consumed by vengeance, Arthur Reeves dies trying to get his revenge on Andrea. So, what do you think about how that was wrapped up in the comics, Steve?
Well, Paul Dini is one of the best writers on the show, so he's the right person to address those points. I like that Andrea seems to learn the value of mercy from Batman, and it also gives it a stronger explanation for why Bruce lets her go. As for Reeves, I figured if he survived, his career was likely ruined by the revelation of his mob connections and the depth of his cover up. Also, having a direct criminal connection to the Joker isn't exactly what I call an image enhancer. So it's nice to see that confirmed. I mean, all that makes sense to me, even if it isn't shown in the film.
Yeah, I really like how that comic filled in those blanks. Dini did that perfectly, and it sounds like we agree on that. But believe it or not, there was actually more to the story. An unmade episode of the animated series' second season called Vigil would have acted as a sequel to this film's flashbacks, while also exploring Bruce and Alfred's relationship. The episode would have had Batman gravely injured and Alfred having to keep him awake while Robin fetches Leslie Tompkins. The flashbacks in that episode would have explored Batman's origin from Alfred's point of view, which I think would have made an interesting episode. In particular, I would have liked to have seen what happened after Bruce first put on the cape and cowl in the film. Alfred realizes Bruce is actually going to carry out his crusade and makes a desperate attempt to talk Bruce out of it, threatening to quit even. But Batman stoically refuses and tells Alfred he can leave. Alfred later watched the news while packing and saw Batman brutally attacked by a group of criminals. Alfred rushes down to the side of the battle using a prop gun from his acting days to stop Batman from murdering a punk kid. I honestly like that the role of Alfred in Batman's life and the man he became cannot be overestimated. In that episode, we would find that Alfred took about part in Batman's no-killing role.
You know, it's a shame that that episode never made it on air because it sounds like a pretty solid story. I think it makes sense that Alfred inspired Bruce not to kill, although I think Thomas Wayne being a doctor had something to do with that as well. The show does acknowledge in various ways that Alfred is Bruce's second father. His line about changing Bruce's diaper certainly alludes to that. Also, Alfred's sort of in the British SAS, and he'd have seen blood and death up close and personal. He'd probably have impressed on Bruce that killing won't bring Ellie real satisfaction or fill the hole left by his parents' death. But speaking of the no-kill rule and father figures, let's get into our next film.
That sounds like a great idea, Steve. Our next film on this top 5 list is Batman Under the Red Hood, which came out in 2010 and is based on the 1988 Batman A Death in the Family storyline by Jim Starlin, 2005's Under the Hood story, and 2010's Red Hood The Lost Days by Judd Winnick. I can't help but wonder if we got that Lost Days story from Judd Winnick in 2010 because they were making an animated film about Under the Hood. The comic came out in June and the movie was out in July of 2010. However, there were some significant changes done in the film, some things left out, which I will get to in a minute. However, it should be noted that Judd Winnick considers the movie the better version of the story. But did you have any opening thoughts about Batman Under the Red Hood, Steve?
I sure do. I admit that I didn't watch Under the Red Hood for quite some time. Sorry to any Jason fans, but it's just largely because Jason Todd was my least favorite Robin for a long, long time. I didn't really change my mind on him until Chip Zdarsky did his urban legend story with Jason Todd a couple of years ago. Even now, I like Nightwing, Tim, and Damian more than I do Jason, but I can see more potential to Jason Todd now than I did before, even if not many writers could get that across. I will admit that Judd Winnick, who wrote the script for Under the Red Hood, as well as the comic it was based on, is one of those people. I feel like this movie does a good job of establishing who Jason is as an adult, making him a dangerous opponent, and then setting him apart from Batman and Nightwing. I feel like he doesn't quite get Nightwing down that well. This Winnick's Nightwing just quips and ends up being a step behind Bruce most of the time, but he does have a clear vision of Jason Todd. And when Bruce and Jason share a scene, there's some real emotional charge to those scenes. Winnick also leans into what I think is Jason's redeeming feature. He has a soft spot for kids, and he doesn't want kids to suffer the way that he did. So Winnick's Jason comes across as a deeper character than just edgy Batman with guns, which is the trap that a lot of Jason writers tend to fall into.
I have to agree that Judd Winnick seems to get both Jason Todd and Red Hood in a way that few others do. And just to touch on that redeeming factor of having a soft spot for kids, Jason actually killed about half of the teachers that trained him when he found out that they were bad folks. Like, and he would do it in very apropos ways. For instance, like one of his first teachers who taught him about poisons and antitoxins turned out to be a child trafficker, and Jason used his newly acquired skills to kill him. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I wanted to do a comparison between the comic version and the film version and hopefully add a little flavor to your viewing experience. One of the major differences between the comics and the film is that Jason was alive before he was put into the Lazarus pit. In other words, the pit is not what brought him back to life. The original intention behind putting Jason in the Lazarus pit was to restore his health and his memories. You see, Jason Todd broke out of his coffin and wandered until he was eventually hospitalized. Jason Todd had never turned up on any missing persons reports as he was never missing, and the hospital had no way of identifying him since there were no fingerprints on file for him. Jason spent a year in a coma in that hospital and another year as a homeless man with amnesia after that, but he retained his fighting skills. In fact, some recognize Jason as Robin because of his moves, and that's when Talia al Ghul, not Ra's al Ghul, came upon Jason Todd and took him in out of her love of Batman and a wish to restore to him what was taken. In fact, Ra's only interest to Todd in the comics was trying to figure out how he came back from the dead and to prevent Batman from finding out that it ever happened. So intent on this was Ra's that he killed everyone in Gotham who had even heard about Jason Todd's resurrection. Ra's even went after the Joker's henchmen who were there when Joker killed Jason in hopes of trying to discover how he could have survived. In the movie, Ra's feels guilty for having hired the Joker, and that hiring him led to the death of Jason Todd. For this reason, he wants to restore to Batman what was taken from him as recompense. So there was a total 180 there between the comics and the film, and they basically gave Ra's Talia's part in the story and removed Talia altogether, which is also weird because they totally gender swapped other characters to give the film a female presence. Anyway, in the comics, Talia not only put Jason into the pit to restore his memories and give him back his health, she also helped him escape Ra's house. It is suggested by Ra's that the power of the pit resulted in Todd's mental instability. Ra's refers to Todd as a curse and a pestilence unleashed upon the planet, saying that the madness may affect him for hours, months, or decades. Talia, like Ra's in the movie, would come to regret unleashing the curse of Jason Todd on the world despite being the one who paid for all of his training and encouraged him to take vengeance on Batman by taking what is most important to him, Gotham, and by being the Batman that Gotham needs. One with no boundaries, no allegiances, or self-important moral codes. Talia told him to cross the lines that Batman won't. And you'll notice that is exactly what Jason Todd does in the film. But Talia did not want Batman to die. After all, her entire motivation in bringing him back was her love for Batman. And I can also say that there is a good chance that she viewed Jason's actions as a way to help Batman by strengthening him rather than by defeating him. Now, there are other slight differences in the film, but none that really matter as much as those that I brought up. I don't think. But I believe there was a bit more differences between the film and the comic that you wanted to talk about as well, wasn't there, Steve?
Yes, there is, though it's good to have the context about how the comics played out because they do gloss over quite a bit here. But one thing I enjoy about Jason in this version is that he's basically pulling something out of a Yojimbo or a fistful of dollars with his methods. He's decided that the way to get rid of crime is to turn everyone against each other and then take out whoever survives. So Jason poses as a new crime lord using an established name, then starts a war with Black Mask and his organization. But even that is part of his larger chess game, as he's using Black Mask as part of his scheme to get revenge on the Joker for murdering him. You can definitely tell that Jason has learned his lessons from Batman well, and he even gets a few points up on Bruce on occasion. It's a pretty well thought out plan, and it very nearly works.
I must admit to not being at that all that familiar with Yojimbo, and it has been some time since I saw a fistful of dollars. But that is definitely what Jason has decided to do. I might suggest an in-story explanation for his strategy, though. Divide et impera, or rather, divide and conquer, is a concept as old as war itself, I imagine. The exact definition is to make a group of people disagree and fight with one another so that they will not join together against a single enemy. Despite its ancient nature, the concept is attributed to Philip II of Macedonia. That's Alexander the Great's father, folks. Julius Caesar used this stratagem to conquer Gaul, and the strategy was also used by Napoleon. I know that Batman, Jason's first trainer, would have had this knowledge, and I damn sure know that Talia, who had a big hand in his further training and strategy, knew this as well. And I'm pretty certain she learned it from Raish. All three of them were classically educated and well versed in conquerors and rulers of the past. I don't know, maybe it's that I love ancient history, but that's how I see it in my head canon. But speaking of history, or rather comics history, I believe you had a point you wanted to make yourself, Steve.
I do, but before I do, I'll just say that I can always appreciate a good callback to Alexander the Great.
Yeah.
That really makes a lot of sense to me. But let's get into it. One noticeable thing about the animated film is that it revises quite a bit of history from the comics. Ra's al Ghul was never originally involved in the Jason Todd story at all. A death in the family mostly just dealt with the Joker, and he wasn't working for Ra's in the comics. For many years, Jason Todd was as dead gets, and I honestly was resistant to bringing him back for a very long time. But that changed after Infinite Crisis or thereabouts. Originally, what happened was that Superboy Prime punched the barrier between realities, and that ended up making changes to the timeline. Don't ask. Jason ended up alive because of those changes. I always thought that was a lame way to bring back a character, but there you go.
From what I know, Jason was restored to the timeline because it was actually not his fate to be killed by the Joker. That actually went against the flow of the timeline, if you will. Plus, if you recall in Hush from 2002, which was a full 3 years before Infinite Crisis in 2005, it was already revealed that while the person Batman saw that looked like Jason was actually Clayface, Jason's body was in fact already missing from his grave. I don't know if that helps at all, but I thought I would throw that out there. But I believe you had a bit more to add there about the handling of Jason's resurrection, didn't you?
I do, but at first I'll just add that a lot of those points are the results of later retcons. Like the writers at DC felt they had to justify their decision to bring Jason back with these additional elements, and all of them just tend to overcomplicate Jason's story in the end. I guess that Judd Winnick must have felt the same way, so he decided to streamline things for this film. And I will say I like this version quite a bit better overall. It makes sense to involve Raish because the Lazarus Pit would be able to revive Jason. I also like the reason Raish has for doing this. He never intended for Joker to kill Jason, but because Raish hired him, he feels like he owes Batman a debt. So Raish may be the master of the League of Assassins, and he may be willing to kill on a grand scale for his cause. But just like Bruce, Ra's al Ghul plays by a set of rules that he refuses to waver from. And when you introduce an element like the Joker, those kinds of rules go out the window. This ends up throwing a huge wrench in Jason's life, and he becomes the Red Hood. There's more of a sense of tragedy this way. First with a young boy's life being cut short, and then Jason being brought back to life in a more damaged state.
Raish's role in the film did work for his character very well. I have to agree with that. However, I think I prefer the comics version as far as Race and Talia are concerned. As to the sense of tragedy, I think it that the moment that hits the hardest in the last scene is the last scene of the movie when we see Jason Todd put on the Robin costume for the first time. When Jason says, "This is the best day of my life," and it cuts to black, it hits hard and undeniably. I mean, at least it did for me.
Oh, that's totally fair. And you seem to be more familiar with a lot of those points than I am. I really like that last scene as well, though, because this film gives you glimpses of what could have been the good kid beneath the red hood. I like the way that it becomes Jason's tragedy, but we'll get into that in a little bit.
That we will. But before we dig too much deeper into Batman Under the Red Hood, let's talk about the casting for a minute. I don't want to go through the whole cast, but I want to point out a couple. I thought John DiMaggio was actually really good as the Joker. I mean, he's not Mark Hamill, but who is besides the man himself? I think part of the reason I liked it so much was that John DiMaggio's Joker's voice was inspired by Heath Ledger's take on the Joker. Bruce Greenwood was an interesting choice for Bruce Wayne and Batman. Like he would not even have occurred to me as a possible choice. But I was surprised at how well he did. I mean, you could hear in his voice why people feared him. I also loved Jensen Ackles as Jason Todd, aka Red Hood. In fact, the reason that Jason Todd drives an Impala in the film is it's an homage to Jensen Ackles' role in Supernatural as Dean Winchester, who drives a similar car. But what about you, Steve? Did you have any performances that really jumped out at you?
Never put the baby in the corner. Anyway, I do have a couple. As a Supernatural fan, I found that Jensen Ackles was the right guy to voice Jason. I mean, he does a great job in this. The Impala Dodd is absolutely perfect for that reason too. Interestingly enough, I mean, he's also played Batman himself. I want to say that he voiced Bruce in the Log Halloween films. Between all his Bat Family voice work and then playing Soldier Boy on The Boys, I get the feeling that Jensen Ackles very much a comics fan, which, as Dean would say, is awesome. John DiMaggio was surprisingly good as a Joker as well. I agree he's not on the level of Mark Hamill, and to be fair, who is? But I think there was a bit of Ledger and a bit of Hamill in there, and it comes together really well. So that comes off well in the scenes that Joker shares with Jason and with Batman.
Actually, that scene with Batman, Red Hood, and the Joker at the end is one of my all-time favorite scenes in all of the DC animated universe. But I will get into that in a minute. I think you're right about Ackles being a comic book fan, especially with the roles he has taken. I mean, even Supernatural totally could have been like a Vertigo comic or something. So we're on the same page there. But I believe there was an important aspect about Red Hood that you wanted to talk about.
Sure, although I will point out that Vertigo was a huge influence on Supernatural, and we see that several times on the show. But Under the Hood does bring back a point that I think has been lost with Jason in the comics, and that is the fact that he's Batman's greatest failure. This is the issue I have with trying to fold Jason in as a member of the Bat family, the way that they've handled him in the most recent comics. I know that the original Red Hood story and a number of the new 52 era comics and so forth have handled this better, but it seems like in the most recent modern Bat stories, Jason is kind of treated like a more or less accepted member of the Bat family, and it just feels like nothing ever happened, and that's regrettable. It takes away the sense of past failure, and it dilutes the weight on Batman's shoulder whenever the subject of a new Robin comes up. I also like Red Hood and Nightwing better when they don't get along, especially when Jason is a villain. But unfortunately, we don't see nearly enough of that in this movie.
I agree that the dissonance between Jason Todd and the rest of the Bat family should have been greater. In this case, with Nightwing at the very least. In the comics, there were definitely issues with seemingly everyone but Batman, from what I recall when it came to the Red Hood, especially between Nightwing and Jason, which was one of the things that made the battle for the Cowl event so intense. The Bat family viewed him as a murderer and a criminal, one of the main reasons they thought he should not succeed Batman. This animosity carried over into the first couple of volumes of the New 52, but I thought they did it in a natural enough way that it didn't feel all of a sudden. This would have been years later. There definitely should have been at least a scene or two depicting that, and I think the film is less for not having it.
Agreed. In any case, I'm really glad to see that when Winnick brought Jason back, he did so in a tragic way. So instead of Jason being the Robin who died because Batman didn't get there soon enough, he's the Robin who lost his way because Batman didn't get there soon enough. It doesn't lessen the sense of tragedy or the guilt that Batman has because he feels responsible. It's just a different kind of tragedy, a tragedy that's built on life rather than death. And that's fascinating to me, honestly.
That is a seemingly brighter take on that darker story to focus on life rather than death. So I like that too. What is particularly tragic about all of that is, as they point out in the film, Batman believed had he not stepped in and made Jason the next Robin, that the darkness in him would have made him grow to do wrong, as Jason was fearless, arrogant, brash, but also gifted. I don't know about you, but that sounds an awful lot like what Batman feared Jason might turn into is actually a crime lord. So when Jason does in fact become a crime lord and has taken everything Batman has taught him and turned it on Batman, Bruce's worst fears about him are realized. It's a hell of his own making, as Bruce says, compounded by his guilt over not just one of his soldiers dying, but I propose that it was also about letting his adopted child die under his watch, which is a pain, as any Batman fan knows, would run really deep in Bruce.
That's a good way of putting it. I like the way the movie makes you really think about Bruce's pain as we see what leads up to it. I think the flashbacks are used really well, and they serve an important purpose. We needed to see the kind of kid that Jason was, the promise that he had, before we can understand what was lost when he became the Red Hood. I like that we get the perspectives of Bruce, Alfred, and Jason clearly in all these scenes as well. I feel like Nightwing was underutilized in this film because I'd have liked to seen his viewpoint as well. But as it is, we get a clear picture of Jason's life as Robin. When it hits those notes properly, I mean, building up a tragic and damaged antagonist rather than a traditional villain.
I thought the flashback scenes were timed well and felt very natural seeing them in bits throughout the film. I thought that was a more reflective of how we actually remember things. It isn't all one big story told back to us all at once. We remember moments at a time. As to their purpose, you nailed it on the head. The film loses weight without the perspective of the past, as the main crux of the film is about the past and its impact on the present. But I think you had some closing thoughts on Batman Under the Red Hood, didn't you, Steve?
I do indeed. This movie surprisingly managed to impress me more than I expected. As an introduction to the Red Hood, it really works, and it gives Batman a problem that he can't solve by just hitting somebody. I also am starting to realize that I like Joker best in stories that are not about him, because that's the case here too. Joker is just a catalyst to set up the real story between Bruce and Jason. The core conflict is between a guilt-ridden father and a son who has lost his way, and neither of them is good at talking things out or compromising. All the other pieces on the board are just there to support and set up that conflict. And when Jason and Bruce are the focus, it has emotional depth and weight. So if you want to do a Jason Todd story, I think you should take notes from this one because it does everything right here.
No, don't spoil it. This is better. I'm the only one who's going to get what they want tonight. Yes, bing, bang, boom. We all go out together. Don't you just love a happy ending? That was a great moment, and it illustrates a point I wanted to add. Joker is definitely not the center of the story, but I did really like how they brought it all together in that broken down apartment building. That climax was perfectly made for all three of them, and I really liked that. But speaking of that very violent Joker in this film, did you know that Under the Red Hood was originally rated R? It was, and apparently it was cut down to a PG-13 because of the low sales of 2009's animated Wonder Woman film, which was also edited down from an R rating. It was also due to 2009's Watchmen not doing well, but that one actually was rated R. Anyway, many Warner Brothers studio heads ordered that Bruce Timm and his animation department completed several edits to make this movie a PG-13 and more accessible to children. Some action scenes were shortened, most gory scenes were removed entirely, i.e., the severed heads of the mafia leaders were originally going to be shown instead of only being implied, and a lot of excessive blood effects were scrubbed away, most notably during Robin's death and post-death scenes. I personally think this was a bad call. Under the Hood is not really a kid's story in that it has themes and ideas in it that a kid just couldn't understand. I'm talking about Batman's struggle with the loss of Jason and Jason's point of view specifically, but not just his point of view. While it is not necessarily the case now, extreme and brutal violence was not just Jason's MO. It was part of what helped one man maintain any kind of order on the streets. So I am of the opinion that Under the Red Hood would have been even better had it not been edited down from an R to a PG-13. But what do you think about that, Steve?
On the one hand, I understand why what WB probably wouldn't want to get too hardcore with one of its most recognizable icons. There probably was an element of the studio trying to protect the brand by not going too far with the content. At the same time, I really don't think that was a real concern with this one. The story definitely would work better with a higher rating because this story deals heavily with the cycle of violence, and that means we need to see it. But as it is, I think we still got a pretty good film, even that might have gotten better with a looser grip. Was there anything you wanted to add before we get to our next film, Mike?
Yes, there is. But before we move on to Batman Year One, I want to talk about a couple of my favorite parts in the film. I loved when Joker killed all those Black Mask guys with that broken water glass and the gun when Black Mask tries to recruit him. It's a great moment, capped off by Joker saying, I need some guys. Not these guys, because they're kind of dead. That was just funny. I don't know what to tell you there. I also liked when the Joker is trying to figure out who the Red Hood is between the beatings with the crowbar. When Joker says, tell me more, and the Red Hood raises the crowbar and says, sure, listen up. My inner Bjorn the Barbarian really liked that. But how about you, Steve? Did you have any favorite parts?
Yeah, I love the flashbacks with Jason as Robin and dealing with the Riddler. The way he did down Riddler was fun while also making the point about what was lost when Jason died and came back. They also kept the scene about Jason boosting the tires off the Batmobile, which actually did come from the comics. I also thought that the standoff with Batman, Jason, and Joker at the end really worked. This is what I was talking about earlier when I said that a hero should take a third option if there's one available. I mean, if there's another way, a hero should take it. And Batman is smart enough to find one. So Batman refuses to accept the box that Jason tries to force him into, finding a way to save Joker and Jason at the same time. Batman comes across as being smart and heroic here. I mean, using his ingenuity to make his moral point.
I really like that as well. I also think that despite the animosity and hatred Red Hood seems to have for Batman, it all comes from a place of love. Emotion so strong could not have come from another source. That Bruce found the third option, as you said, and that he saved both Joker and Jason not only makes his moral point about killing, in my opinion. I believe in that moment he proved that Bruce was the superior Batman and the hero that Gotham needs. But let's move on to Batman Year One.
Yeah, I had to free frame it a little bit, but I think your point is on target. It's less that Bruce is the better Batman and more that his approach to being Batman is the better way. Jason clearly has the ability to be a great Batman and perhaps could have been if not for what Joker and Ra's did to him. The problem is that he doesn't have Bruce's absolute dedication to his code or his sense of mercy. But as you suggest, let's move on. I don't think we could do a list like this without bringing up the works of Frank Miller. Miller looms large over Batman, so much so that he tends to have influence every time there's a new Batman film. However, the next couple of films we'll be talking about come closest to pure Miller because they're direct adaptations of his two best known stories. First, we'll talk about Batman Year One, which is my favorite Miller Batman story. One thing I love about it is that it works just as well today as it was the day it was written. Year One focuses on the elements of Batman, bringing them together in a way that works, and you don't need to update or change it ever again. At the same time, it's not just a story about Bruce Wayne and how he starts his career as Batman. Jim Gordon works as a secondary main character, showing a different perspective on Gotham and dealing with corruption in the police department as he rises through the ranks. In the end, it shows where Bruce and Jim's friendship begins, and that's a really great place to start with Batman. Mike, what are your thoughts on Year One?
Well, let me get some details out of the way first. Batman Year One was originally published in Batman number 404 through 407 from February 1987 to May 1987, and was actually written to be a graphic novel without any ads in it. As we know, Frank Miller wrote it, but he did not do the art himself on the comic, which was rare for him. Instead, artist David Mazzucchelli took the job. To add to its pulpy feel, it was originally printed on newspaper, and that is why the colors are different in the graphic novel version. The different paper meant the colors were different, and so when it was released in a 96-page graphic novel, the colors had to be redone. Year One is also my favorite Frank Miller Batman story, so we have that in common. Also, I have to comment on how well the comic book was adapted. Producer Bruce Timm noted that the adaptation of the film was relatively straightforward due to the cinematic nature of the original story arc. But not only is it basically play by play from the comic, even the spirit of Year One's artist, David Mazzucchelli's art comes through. Mazzucchelli sought to make Year One look grimy, dark, and muted. interpretation of Gotham City was designed to symbolize corruption, featuring muddy colors that gave the impression of the city being dirty and needing a hero, and that is absolutely how it comes across in the movie. Mazzucchelli's art is a bit more gritty in the comics, but I think the adaptation was brilliant all around here. But let's get into the film.
Sure, but first I'll start by mentioning that that probably was a big part of the reason that Miller teamed up with Mazzucchelli on year one was that this wasn't their first rodeo together. They had previously worked together on the equally iconic Daredevil Born Again, and there too, Mazzucchelli showed that he grasped Miller's noir style with visual flair. From there, year one took it to another level, which is saying something considering how great Born Again is, and I do recommend it. But let's get on with the film itself. This story starts on just the right note, showing us the different worlds that Bruce and Jim come from. There are parallels with both of them arriving in Gotham. Jim coming to Gotham for the first time, and Bruce returning after his long trip around the world and learning the tools that he'd use as Batman. But they come in from completely different viewpoints. Jim is the ground floor view of Gotham, seeing the seediness and corruption up close. Meanwhile, Bruce arrives by plane, seeing Gotham from above as a billionaire would, and feeling disconnected from the city he's trying to save. You begin to see why Bruce and Jim ultimately need each other. Bruce can act in ways that Jim can't, while Jim has a clear picture of what needs to be done in a way that Bruce hasn't figured out yet. Miller clearly figured out where he needed them to start, and the animated film, picks that up and runs with it.
It most certainly does that. And if I could build on what you said there for a minute, Batman Year One is totally a neo noir Batman, built on a crime noir comic. Uh, right from the start, it hits those same beats we would later see in Frank Miller's Sin City with Bruce's narrated dialogue. Gotham City, clean shafts of concrete and snowy rooftops. The work of men who died generations ago. From here, it looks like an achievement. From here, you can't see the enemy. Then, like the noir novel about two detectives rather than one, we get the same beats from Jim Gordon opening narration. 12 hours, trains no way to come into the city. Thank God Barbara is flying in. She should have gotten the test back by now. I only hate myself a little for hoping it came out negative. This is no place to raise a family. Maybe Gotham's all I deserve now. Maybe it's just my time in hell. Then then the Batman Year One logo comes up. That was a great opening, and set the mood and the pace for the story, and fully centered it on a neo noir genre. What's more is that this type of feel would carry on to other stories that followed Year One. Not the same obviously influenced stories, but the feel of that gritty and real detective Batman. And one last thing, I have to pull a Frank Miller quote about Batman as a character because I think it's reflective of what we see in the film. Frank Miller said, "He's clearly a man with a mission, but it's not one of vengeance. Bruce is not after personal revenge. He's much bigger than that. He's much more noble than that. He wants the world to be a better place where a young Bruce Wayne would not be a victim. In a way, he's out to make himself unnecessary. Batman is the hero who wishes he didn't have to exist." But I believe you had something to say about the characters in the film, didn't you, Steve?
Sure, though I will say that Miller got it with that quote. The one thing I like about this series is how it really adds characters to the mythos rather than just playing with established names. Gil Loeb is a pretty solid villain in this story, even if we don't see him really used elsewhere. Flass is another villain I like because he represents everything that Gordon is fighting against and is trying not to become. And then you have Carmine the Roman Falcone, who ends up being a bigger character later because of the Long Halloween. Miller builds these new characters and gives us more of a crime noir, with Batman and Jim Gordon having to clear out the system before dealing with costume criminals. Most writers today probably just throw the Joker halfway into it, but he hasn't even mentioned until the last scene. In fact, the only one of Batman's rogues who even appears is Catwoman, and she plays a relatively small role. It's as much an origin for Selina as it is for Bruce. To the film's credit, they really keep to that, holding to Miller's vision rather than dropping in big name Bat villains. While I have issues with the way Selina is presented in the series, I mean the movie respects the original comic for good and ill, for good or ill, and I totally respect that.
I have to say that having read stories like The Long Halloween, I just love seeing the Roman and the Commissioner Loeb in Year One. We don't really see them stretch their legs, so to speak, but it was very fun to see them there. As for Gordon, Bryan Cranston knocked it out of the park with that role. But that aside, there was very telling line from Gordon that really painted a picture when he was watching Flash beat up that kid. Don't do a damn thing. Be sure of your facts before you bring down another cop. Just watch him. Memorize every move for future reference. When you compare that to when Jim was talking to Commissioner Loeb and he said, I know I've made my mistakes, sir. And Loeb responds, what mistakes did you make, Lieutenant? You kept the media away from it. That's all that matters. And add that Jim Gordon was just moving to Gotham City because of what happened in the last city he was in, and it adds a whole other layer to the story that isn't necessarily spelled out. As for adding to the mythos rather than rehash old names, that was intentional. Listen to this quote by Frank Miller about year one. I didn't feel that fleshing out an unknown part of Batman's history justified wiping out 50 years of adventures. Thus, the 4 year one issues bear no continuity to past issues of Batman.
True, and this story stands apart from the main Batman myth as well, fitting quite well in it. I also agree that Cranston is excellent as Gordon, and it's a great change of pace for him after Walter White. But let's get into one of my favorite moments in this movie. This movie understood what became my favorite scene in the whole book. At first, the corrupt powers in Gotham are more than happy to let Batman be, because he makes them look good. But then Batman breaks into a fancy dinner party held by Gotham's elite, openly calls them out, and then tells them none of them are safe from him. It's a great scene because it shows the theatricality of Batman, and it shows how Batman isn't bound by the rules made and enforced by the corrupt officials of Gotham. But it's also a scene that has consequences because after that, Commissioner Loeb and the corrupt cops start openly hunting Batman for the rest of the story. That scene was adapted really well in animation, I thought. Did you have any thoughts on the scene, Mike? And did you have a favorite scene you wanted to talk about?
That scene was brilliant, and another one pulled straight out of the comic. I liked that scene because it showed that Batman was progressing. Bruce talked about having the skill and the resources, but something was missing, and that ingredient was, as you mentioned, theatricality. He tried it first with the makeup, and then with the bat suit, and here we see him setting up proper lighting, killing the power to the house, throwing in a smoke bomb, blowing out the window to add to the fear of the moment. That was a lot of setup there to make the perfect scene. Plus, that was just a great line. Ladies and gentlemen, you've eaten well. You've eaten Gotham's wealth, its spirit. But your feast is nearly over. From this moment on, none of you are safe. I think my favorite scene was when he was running from the cops and he got shot in the leg. Then they dropped a bomb on the building and he lost his bat belt and took a good whooping in the process. This might sound weird, but I like that he was beaten and bleeding out and had all but just a couple of basic tools and weapons are left to get him out of it. It goes back to a lesson learned in Green Lantern story I read when the Lantern's power ring died. It was all about proving that real lanterns are Green Lanterns even without the ring. And that scene, it was about Batman using his wits more than his fancy gadgets to get out. And I really like that. Plus, under the hail of AK 47 bullets, he slides in, rescues that cat, tosses it out the window. That was just awesome.
Absolutely, it's a great save the cat moment. The police chase scene where Batman escapes into the rundown building to escape the cops tends to be homaged quite often. They use a similar scene in Batman Begins, for instance, and we talked about something similar with Mask of the Phantasm. But it all began with Year One and the sequence that gets used in this film. I think part of the reason we see this so often is that it's laid out really well by Frank Miller and Dave Mazzucchelli in the original comic, and it visually comes across well. But it's also a scene that works because it shows Batman in real trouble and at his lowest point, and how he's able to get out of that situation by being smart with limited resources. And it also goes to show that no matter how desperate the situation is for Bruce, he still will not break his code. He'll never kill anyone or hurt anyone he doesn't have to. I feel like every scene in Year One serves a purpose and tells us something about these characters, and that's one of the strengths of it.
I like that a lot too. That's definitely another big reason I like the scene. But I am particularly impressed by Miller's ability to tell a story through little purpose filled blips. It's almost, now mind you, I said almost, feels like a little short connected stories that don't necessarily fill in all the gaps between, but still works. It's like Miller just hits the highlights of the month and moves on. It would not even have occurred to me to write a story like that. But then again, I could not have told the story in 4 issues either. I don't know. I'm just fascinated by the writing style.
I doubt too many writers could, especially after in the age of decompressed storytelling. But I love what Miller's able to do with it. While Gordon is played as a hero cop in this story, he has some real vulnerability in the story that we don't often see. He has a distant relationship with his wife because he's constantly at work, and he has an office romance with a woman that he really connects with, even though he knows it's wrong to have an affair with her. Sarah Essen seems to me like someone who represents Gordon's love of his job, except as an actual person. I feel like Gordon's arc is about deciding what's more important to him, the job he loves doing or his family. So it seems to me like in many ways, Gordon is the real hero of the story because he's the one who has to make a choice. Jim is ready to drop everything to save his son, but fortunately, his friendship with Batman means that he never truly has to. In that moment, Gordon knows what his priorities in life are and what he has to do for Gotham. It's a really strong ending, and I feel like we see that play out just right in the film. Did you have any other thoughts on year one that you wanted to mention before we move on to our next film, Mike?
I think we pretty much covered my thoughts on this film, but I do have some interesting trivia about Batman Year One. The story was almost adapted into a live action film by Frank Miller and directed by Darren Aronofsky. However, Warner Brothers scrapped the project in favor of doing Christopher Nolan's 2005 Batman Begins. Batman Year One was also the working title for the fifth Batman movie, but the studio scrapped the idea after Batman and Robin garnered mostly negative feedback. But check this out. The story for that film was altered a bit and made into the WB TV series Smallville. I don't know about you, but I would have never connected the dots between Batman Year One in any form and Smallville.
I know I wouldn't have. I never followed Smallville all that closely anyway, and it seems like it would be a weird fit tonally. But year one isn't the only adaptation of Frank Miller that we wanted to talk about. So let's get into how DC Animation handled Batman's future. Do you want to get started on the next feature on our list, Mike?
I most certainly do, Steve. Batman The Dark Knight Returns was a 1986 four-issue comic book series written by Frank Miller, illustrated by Miller, and Klaus Johnson, with color by Lynn Varley. When originally published, the series was simply titled Batman the Dark Knight, with a different subtitle for each issue: The Dark Knight Returns, The Dark Knight Triumphant, Hunts the Dark Knight, and The Dark Knight Falls. But when the series was collected into a single volume later that year, the title was of the first issue was applied to the entire series and has remained so ever since. The miniseries, the first of a trilogy of limited series based on this version of Batman, was followed by The Dark Knight Strikes Again, The Dark Knight 3, The Master Race. But as far as the movie adaptation goes, unlike the comics, the film is set in the same continuity as Batman Year One. In fact, you'll note that Jim's wife Barbara has already divorced him and taken James Jr. with her, and he is now with Sarah Essen, the woman he had an affair with in Batman Year One. The Dark Knight Returns also takes place after the death of Jason Todd. What's weird about that is that The Dark Knight Returns came out 2 years before a Death in the Family storyline in which Jason Todd died. So the original readers of The Dark Knight Returns, they had no idea about Jason Todd dying, and therefore that reveal was huge. But Jason Todd didn't just die. There was a poll taken in Batman number 427 in which readers could call a 1-900 number and vote on whether or not Jason Todd would live in Batman number 428. I bring that up because I wonder if a Death in the Family was influenced or not by A Dark Knight Returns with the whole idea of killing off Jason Todd. I think Miller had something else in mind as far as how Todd likely died, because Bruce says, "I will never forget Jason. He was a good soldier. He honored me, but the war goes on." That that is definitely not how Batman would have described things after a death in the family. But what do you think of that, Steve?
I winced when I heard the good soldier line, I have to admit, because you're right. That's not how Bruce would speak about a beloved son that was taken from him. It's not how he would think about Jason or Dick or Damian or any of the rest of his Robins or his other proteges. They are his children. And even if Bruce has problems admitting his real feelings about them, he loves them in the way a father loves his kids. I've long felt that Bruce adopts orphans because he wants to fill the void left by the deaths of his parents. So losing Jason to someone like the Joker would only add to the deep pain and loss that he's already been struggling with. There are various things I disagree with Miller on when it comes to the story, and this one is certainly up there for me. But let's get into the actual film, shall we, Mike?
That sounds like a great idea, but I'm glad that line bothered you as much as it did me. As you say, though, let's get into the film. Batman The Dark Knight Returns is a two-part animated film. Part 1 is 76 minutes long and part 2 is 75 minutes long. I personally recommend the deluxe edition of this film as it combines both parts into a seamless film, although the transition between the two is slightly different. And I myself enjoy it more without having to stop in the middle and then start the next movie. Plus, it comes with 2 discs of great special features, including 4 episodes of Batman the Animated Series, an episode of The Brave and Bold, and several great featurettes. But I have started to stray off my topic a bit with the movie collection stuff. So, do you have any opening thoughts about this film before we dive into it, Steve?
Now, this may surprise some people given what a fan I am of Frank Miller and especially his 80s work, so I'm going to drop this one on you. I don't love The Dark Knight Returns nearly as much as some people do. Don't get me wrong, I am not saying that the story is bad. I really enjoyed it the first time I read it, and I respect some of the things it does. It was a landmark story at the time it came out. But where year one has grown on me more and more over time, Dark Knight Returns is a story with more diminishing returns over time for me. The story is really grounded in the 1980s, and I don't think it's really aged all that well in the decades since. This is a story about the future as seen from 1985, while also being a commentary of the world as it was back then in really obvious ways. The world has changed a lot since then, and there's a lot in this story that's no longer relevant. And some of the elements that have been influential have been used over and over again, so much so that I don't particularly care to go back to them. I'm honestly at the point where I don't want to see another Batman versus Superman fight again, unless there's a really good take on it, preferably one that adds something new to the formula. Sadly, I just think the power of Dark Knight Returns has been dulled through time and repetition, and I'm now at the point where I'm not even particularly interested in reading the original book again. So the fact that the two Dark Knight Returns animated films make this list ought to tell you something. They did a really good job of bringing the story to the screen, and we'll get into why we think that soon enough.
You are absolutely right about The Dark Knight Returns being fully set in a dystopian future of 1985. I think the big mistake was throwing in Ronald Reagan. I think it might not have been so obvious without that. But I want to touch briefly on the Cold War influence on The Dark Knight Returns, but not just in the Batman film. You'll note the same influence on Alan Moore's Watchmen that was being published around the same time as The Dark Knight Returns. Both comics were seminal in their deconstruction of America during the Cold War and superheroes. But more on point, the threat of nuclear annihilation permeated across all mediums in the 80s. And just like Watchmen's doomsday clock, around the time these comics were coming out, it felt as if we were in fact approaching midnight. I don't know about you, Steve, but stuff like that takes me right back to that time. That is particularly relevant because the idea that any moment we could die led to the sense that we really needed to live in the moment. There's a reason the whole punk movement was screaming that we had no future at that time. That's why there are so many dystopian movies from the 70s and the 80s. And I think that is why Gotham has sunk as low as it has in The Dark Knight Returns, in part because of those fears.
That sounds very plausible to me. This movie definitely keeps the trappings of the future as seen in 1985. I think it tends to get more obvious in part two, where Superman is just clearly working for Ronald Reagan, because I agree with you that it doesn't age overly well. Doubly so since Reagan hasn't been alive in quite some time. But you see some of it even when you listen to Carrie's parents in the background, where it's clear that Miller intended them to be Woodstock style hippie parents. I mean, the TV segments also tend to criticize issues that were a problem at the time and aren't now, or reference people who had been famous in 1985, but probably nobody who wasn't there remember today. I doubt anyone would know who Dr. Ruth is, for instance, if they hadn't been around at the time. The interesting thing, though, is that this is exactly how Batman is treated when he comes back. That comes across particularly in the scene with the two cops, where the older cop knows not to get in Batman's way, but his young partner keeps trying to arrest him because he doesn't know who Batman is. It ends exactly as you'd expect it would. So even though I don't think it applies well in a real world sense necessarily, the generation gap is a real thing in the world of the two films.
The generation gap does have some real world application, in my opinion. Not only does the world change, but people change too. There are just certain things that you might have done when you were young that you would not do as an adult because time has taught you to do otherwise. I don't know. I know that I have experienced it myself. How about that? So, but it is not, it is most certainly in the comic, like you said. Also, you bring up the thing, Carrie. You bring up the thing about Carrie's parents being Woodstock style hippie parents, and they certainly are. But they are also rather absentee, as even when they are home, they are too wasted to do any parenting. I mean, they have no idea what Carrie is doing, getting into through the whole movie. My point is that I think Carrie was in need of some parenting and structure, and Batman became that for her. And in doing so, the familial bond between Batman and Robin continues.
That certainly makes sense to me. Carrie managed to grow up a good kid, even with distant and detached parents that didn't understand her. So she latches on to someone else, gets a huge case of hero worship, and that develops into a surrogate father-daughter relationship by the end of the series. And again, we see Bruce trying to fill this deep void in his life after all the people he's lost. So he ends up adopting Carrie, much as he did with the previous Robins. But we'll get in more into Bruce and Carrie's relationship in a bit. Watching the story again, I'm realizing that much of Dark Knight Returns is a satire of 80s pop psychology. Bartholomew Wolper is constantly siding with the villains, even knowing what these people have done. Wolper lives in the world of his own theories, and they just don't work in reality. You see this a lot with Ivory Tower academics. I mean, people that convince themselves of their own big ideas, not understanding that the world doesn't work that way. Wolper is a type of academic who seems to deny reality to fit his theories rather than adjust his theories to fit reality. Dark Knight Returns seems to be extremely critical of this kind of thinking, and it ends up causing a lot of people to die in this story. Wolper sees Batman as this dangerous psychotic who creates these monsters, not realizing that Two-Face and the Joker have issues that go well beyond Batman. Fixing Harvey Dent's face doesn't really fix his deeper psychological problems at all. And predictably, he goes back to his old tricks and Dent dies as a result. And not learning from that disaster and the loss of his patient, Wolper decides to take the Joker out on the talk show circuit. This is honestly more insane to me than anything the Joker does in this story. I think Miller is mocking this kind of psychology, the type that wants to coddle dangerous criminals rather than deal with the real underlying problems. Am I off base with this, Mike, or do you think there's something to that?
Uh, yes and no. Simply having an authority in existence is enough to provoke challenges. In fact, according to the Bible, there was no sin before there was law because there was nothing to point out what was wrong in the first place. You'll note that the Garden of Eden, there was all but one law: don't eat from the damn tree. And it was just a matter of time until they did, in fact, eat from the tree. Uh, Basically, having the rule actually led to its being broken. So blaming the law itself is one perspective. Another would be that mankind is fundamentally flawed and destined to destroy itself, and therefore create a need for the law to exist. It's really kind of dealer's choice there on how one wants to view it. There's even room to see that both perspectives can be true at the same time, that one feeds into the other regardless of how it starts. But bear in mind that all of that logic is based on sanity. When you're talking about the Joker, Two-Face, or Batman for that matter, we're not talking about those that are sane. We're talking about severely broken people just to do the things that Two-Face and Joker do. At the same time, we know that there is something broken about Batman because of his witnessing the murder of his parents. That was not just traumatic, but disturbing. From that moment on, Bruce could barely think of anything else but his mission of vengeance and guilt to make sure that what happened to him never happens to anyone else. Batman is not your typical vigilante where he is just standing up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. He is on a mission so focused that almost anything can be sacrificed for. The only reason he took a break was because of Jason, yet another trauma. But Batman is who he is ultimately, despite being a man of two identities, and that connects him to Two-Face. Dent's face was remade so that both sides of his face looked like the Harvey Dent side instead of the more monstrous looking Two-Face side. But to Dent's eyes, both sides now look like the monstrous half, which is reflective of his perception on which personality was actually the evil one. But it also speaks of Batman too, in that neither one of them, no matter how hard they tried, could pretend to be something that they were not. That is important from a storytelling perspective, and so too is the Joker's part in this. Frank Miller was the first person out of all the Joker stories to show that the Joker needs Batman. He was basically a sack of potatoes for all the years that Batman was retired. But the mere mention of Batman being back in action brought him back from the drug-induced stupor that the mental health facilities kept people in back then, and his retreat into himself. He had lost all purpose without Batman, and in the Joker's own words, I thought I was Batman's psychotic obsession. Something was also ignited in Batman when the Joker came back. So I think that at least as far as Batman comics go, there is enough evidence, in my opinion, to suggest that Batman feeds into his rogues gallery like his rogues gallery feeds on into him. And as far as reality, I think whichever came first, the wrongdoing or the law stating it was wrong, both seem to feed into each other in an undeniable way. It was no accident that their final fight was in the tunnel of love. While they are not lovers, well, their bond as opposite sides of a coin is reflected in that, I think. Plus, Joker certainly used the nomenclature associated with such a relationship, calling Batman darling and whatnot.
There definitely is a case of there being two to tango in that relationship. Certainly, there's an element of Batman pushing Joker's button to a certain extent just by being who he is. So I can appreciate your points there. But really, I think what irritated me most about Wolpers and his entire mindset is that he seems to put all the burden on Batman and little to none on the criminals, to the point where he's actively putting people in danger to further his agenda against Batman. He's at the very least negligent in the extreme and blind to the dangers that he's created. And at the worst, he's using the criminals to raise his own media profile, and he doesn't care about the consequences. It's just completely irresponsible and dangerous. And much of what happens as a result is on him. But let's move on to another important character in all this. I like the majority of the Robins, and I'd include Carrie Kelly as another of the good ones. Looking back on it now, I understand why there's a Robin in this story. Miller needed someone who can contrast Bruce's advanced age and bring in some youth and enthusiasm, which Carrie does well. But she's also a character who represents the younger viewpoint, in contrast to older Bruce, who's lost touch from being out of circulation for years. At the same time, she's good at what she does. She's loyal to Bruce, and she does the Watson role, which is to let Bruce look smart by asking the right questions. I think Bruce and Carrie balance each other out well, and I like the way their relationship grows in the story. What are your impressions of Carrie as Robin, Mike?
Well, I get her purpose from a writing standpoint. I'm just not a fan of Carrie Kelly. It felt like a plot device and nothing more. There was not enough time to build an emotional attachment to her character, and I just couldn't connect with her beyond being a Batman fanboy. Don't get me wrong, I don't hate her character or her place in the story, but comparatively, she's at the bottom of my favorite Robins list. Mostly, I'm not a fan because taking her in as Robin violates a vow that Batman took. Bruce is not one to change his mind without insurmountable evidence and having seen it with his own eyes. Every decision Bruce makes has been meticulously thought out, oft times well before it happens. When Batman is standing there and staring at Robin's costume and reminds himself of an old promise, never again, he was talking about having a Robin. Alfred reminds him of this vow later when he's asked if he needed to remind Bruce of what happened to Jason. So Batman was breaking his own vow. So there was more to Alfred freaking out about bringing Carrie to the Batcave and revealing his identity than what would seem obvious. Carrie is a character that basically starts out in hero worship position after Batman saves her and her friends at the arcade. She immediately becomes obsessed and even goes out and gets herself a Robin costume and starts to train herself on how to be Robin, which has issues as we find out. She almost kills herself climbing out of the window on her first night, as she obviously does not know how to fight. While she saved Batman by jumping on Leader's back and covering his eyes, she was quickly in a worse situation. And Batman, broken, bleeding, and about to pass out, actually has to save her. But at the same time, had that not gone down the way it did, the Leader would not have been defeated. I think the reason Bruce was willing to tell her his identity, take her to the Batcave, and let her be Robin was that Batman recognized that Carrie has the Robin spirit, raw and unrefined by training, but it was there. Carrie was a teenager who Batman actually saw a glimmer of hope in, which was quite a light in the darkness of most of the youth of that day. Carrie also brought some heart to the Dark Knight story instead of just pissed off old Batman anymore, like you said.
Yeah, that is an interesting take. Though I think I was less bothered by Batman going on his decision than you were. I feel like part of the Bruce's problem in the Dark Knight universe is that Jason's death detaches him more and more from humanity to the point that he becomes a total recluse. I don't think he vows not to take another Robin because of any high-minded reasons or desire to protect other kids he might train. I think it comes from a place of pain and loss because Jason's death hit him so hard. And while that's understandable, it comes at the cost of pushing everyone in the world away from him, except for Alfred and Gordon. He's completely disconnected from the world around him, and when he comes back, he struggles much more as Batman because of how much the world has changed. So when Carrie shows up, she's able to operate effectively in this world because she understands it on a level that Batman can't. I took Batman accepting Carrie as Robin as his realization that he can't do everything by himself anymore because trying to nearly killed him, and that he needs a partner who could function better in this new Gotham. And I think deep down, Bruce is still trying to fill the void left by the deaths of his parents and the loss of Jason. And I don't think it's in Bruce's nature to turn his back on kids who need his guidance, no matter what he might tell himself. But that gets into something that works about this film. One point I really like about these films is that it deals with an older Bruce in a believable way. This Batman is slower and he's not able to fight at the same physical level that he does normally. That comes across in the fight with the mutant leader, who is ludicrously strong, and Bruce gets his ass kicked when he tries to fight him in a direct way. He gets beaten so badly that Carrie has to pull him out of the fight, and then Alfred has to patch him back together. But this Bruce is more experienced, he's craftier, and he eventually learns how to play it to his strengths against tougher opponents. So you get that fight in the mud where Bruce wins by fighting dirty at every turn, which is totally a Batman thing to do. This is the Batman I like to see, where he walks into bad situations and he faces setbacks, but he learns from his failures and he overcomes adversity by playing it smarter.
I really like that as well. In fact, brains really are Batman's superpower. I heard Denny O'Neil make a Homeric comparison to Batman and Odysseus. Batman is like Odysseus in that Odysseus was a highly skilled fighter, yet Odysseus' greatest weapon was his mind. Odysseus did not try to fight the Cyclops. Rather, he got him drunk until he passed out and then plunged that burning stake into his eye. He tried a straight up confrontation with the giant, then he would have ended up as easily devoured as his friends had been. Odysseus outsmarted him and left without a trace as he told the Cyclops his name was nobody, and that's the only answer the Cyclops could give about who had taken out his eye. Ironically, you'll note that Batman takes out the mutant leader's eye as well, with that cut above his eye bleeding into it. It's not an exact parallel, but I think the point stands.
I think it does, and I appreciate the Odysseus comparison. I would not have thought to bring it up, but it sounds right to me. Also, Odysseus is driven by his desire to reclaim his family, and that's important to Batman as well. So Bruce is definitely a character in that tradition, I would say. But let's move on to our next point. To be honest, I ended up not liking Ellen Yandel through most of these two films. They try to set her up as an honest cop who just has a difference of opinion about Batman with Gordon, and I'd respect that if she came across as a competent officer, but most of the problems we see end up being her fault because she devotes more energy to capturing Batman than dealing with the villains he's trying to stop. At first, she's just a nuisance, and then her weirder obsession with capturing Batman ends up being truly dangerous and contributing to the problem. While Yandel is caught up in taking down Batman, the police are distracted and allow Joker to kill everyone inside a David Endocrine studio. Also, as an aside, Endocrine is Miller's parody of David Letterman. He looks exactly like Letterman in the comic. So anyway, all these dead people are on Yandel as far as I'm concerned. And then she doesn't learn her lesson from this, and she continues to chase down Batman while the Joker continues to cause mayhem in the amusement park. At no point does Yandel acknowledge her part in all the death and mayhem that the Joker causes. The most she does is tacitly admit that Gordon was right, echoing his earlier point to her that Batman was too big for them. But by then it's too late, and a lot of people are dead on her watch because of her obsession and her bad decisions. That final admission does keep her from being completely unlikable, but by then the damage was done, and there's just no coming back from that.
I think this honestly goes back to that generation gap thing we talked about earlier. Yandel was the younger generation that hadn't learned all the lessons of the previous generation and was convinced that she knew better. And there is something to be said about youth and innovation. But in this case, it also showed an inability to listen. Gordon laid out very well, I might add, the complicated nature of dealing with Batman and what he has learned in his experience, and she didn't hear a word of it. You could tell she was just sitting there waiting for the old man to shut up. She does become so convinced that she is doing that she is of what she is doing, though, that it blinds her to what is really going on, like you pointed out. All of that to say, I was not a big fan of her character either.
It might be a certain level of youthful arrogance is in play here. That is an interesting point. Anyway, let's talk about the Batman Superman fight. While it had a huge impact at the time, in retrospect, I have some issues with it. Some of those concerns and fairness come from the way this fight was received and how influential it ended up being, which is not Miller's fault at all. Other things are due to the portrayal itself and just little points that bother me. Still, the way it plays out in terms of the action works better than I thought, and I think part two brings it on screen quite nicely. First, let me get in my criticisms of the conflict itself. I really don't like Clark as someone who would blindly follow the government in the way that he does here. While I understand that the government would send someone after Batman, and having it be Clark gives some good character conflict, it's not a portrayal I enjoy all that much. Clark, as a reporter, should be questioning power at every turn, and Superman should always choose the right thing over what the authorities tell him he should do. There are moments where Clark does feel on target, though. I think it makes sense that he would try to keep Bruce from going too far in his crusade, for instance. And I love the wink at the end of Carrie, which is a very Clark thing to do. I just don't buy that Clark would support the Cordo Maltese War or that he would go along with the president when he tries to take down Bruce. But I also don't like the precedent that this story set or the way that it impacted the way that the Batman Superman relationship has been handled since. Firstly, I've just grown tired of writers that constantly pit Bruce and Clark against each other. There have been times when it's worked. Kingdom Come is a great example where they grow together as friends after an initial conflict. But these fights have been overdone so much that I want to see Bruce and Clark just be friends again and fight villains instead of each other. Dark Knight Returns, along with Grant Morrison's JLA run, also started the Bat God trend, where Batman is always better than everybody and he's never allowed to have any human vulnerability. And I hate it. Bruce should always have a plan and he should always be prepared where it makes sense. But a character who could never be wrong and never lose is boring. That's more on later writers and less on Miller, but Dark Knight Returns started that ball rolling.
I have to agree that I kind of just I'm kind of conflicted about that. I suppose actually, on one hand, I feel like Batman is smart enough to outsmart everybody, but that is kind of boring when that's the same card they play every time. I have a few thoughts on what you said there, though. Actually, in the comics, at the same time the Dark Knight Returns came out, the idea of vilifying Superman was unheard of. Sure, he had been mind controlled or something in the past, but he had not been a villain. But think about it. In that one scene where we see him destroying those warships fighting for America, he kills more people than Joker did in his whole life, and that was on the regular. Superman felt justified in it because someone was giving him permission to kill. But the old Superman, even if put in a situation where he had to fight in a war, would find a way not to kill. But there was no mercy or even an attempt at another resolution. I'm not saying that soldiers who do that stuff are villains. I'm saying that Superman is contradicting his own moral code and he's fine with it. Except in the case of Bruce. When Superman used his heat vision to burn Ware into the ground, that could have very well been Batman's death if Superman would have wanted it to be. But Clark showed restraint because they were friends, and that same restraint was carried over into their fight later. Superman could have killed Batman at any moment or even just hurt him severely, but he held back. At the same time, Superman was not the only one to show restraint. Batman could have made that kryptonite compound in such a way that it would have killed Clark, but he didn't do that. In a way, the fight was really a big show for Reagan and the soldiers. By the end of it, in so many words, Batman agrees to try not to be such a loud mysterious, to use Oliver's words, so as to give Superman an out so he doesn't have to come after him again. And Superman, with his knowing wink to Carrie at the graveyard, agrees to back off of him. In essence, they agree to stay out of each other's way.
Yeah, that resolution I thought was fine. I mean, the wink is something that Superman does a lot, and I like how it's used here. Now, what you described early on captures exactly where I'm at with Dark Knight Returns, because you're right. Miller did something that was truly groundbreaking at the time he did it. This is, again, a situation where the power of the story has been diluted and washed out over time because the novelty of the idea wore off. There are times when an idea comes along that's truly new and it breaks out of the old status quo, and then it gets so overused that it becomes the new status quo. And then it's just hard to look at the original story that started the trend in the same way that I did before. I think what's needed is a new approach that can capture lightning in a bottle again, but I have no idea what that would take. Still, the film does hold better than I remembered in some ways, though. I had honestly forgotten that Superman had taken a direct strike from a nuke before his showdown with Bruce, but it explains a lot. I think it's easy to forget that the only reason Batman wins here is that he's dealing with a vastly weaker Superman than normal. The nuke, Batman's armor, and the kryptonite arrow, which by the way took years to set up, are the only things that keep Bruce in this fight, not to mention Clark holding back the entire time. This was not a sure thing at all, and Superman could have turned the fight the other way at several points during the fight if he truly wanted to. These are bits of context that tend to be forgotten now, but the movie remembers to include them, and I appreciate that.
I really like that as well. In fact, I really like the film, and out of all the times I have seen the Joker in a Batman story, and of all the times Joker has tried to push Batman into crossing the line, this is my favorite. Of all the possible ends for the Joker, this one I think best suits both the Joker and Batman and worked out in a very satisfying way. I also love the Two-Face story and how they flipped the coin, if you'll excuse the pun, on which side of Harvey Dent was actually the evil side. Plus, between the fight with the mutant leader in the mud pit and the fight with Superman, we got a couple of my favorite Batman fights. There was a reason this movie made our top five. It hits a lot of good points in just the right way. But what do you say we get into our final film in the top five, Steve?
Sure, let's get into it. I regret to say I didn't get into Batman Beyond until years after it went off the air. I think my issue at the time was just that I didn't see the point of that show. I mean, an older Batman was something we'd seen before, and I didn't understand why they were doing a new version. I eventually figured it out years later after I saw the first episode of the series. And then I realized that Terry McGinnis is basically a cyberpunk version of Spider Man, with Bruce as more of a mentor figure who has to rely on the new kid to pursue his mission. And as a fan of Spider-Man 2099, I can get down with that approach. Return of the Joker was the story that had to be told, and I think I need to explain why it's on the list. Firstly, it's as much a story about Bruce as it is about Terry McGinnis. Terry has to prove himself against Bruce's most dangerous foe, so he gains something from the encounter. But it's also about Bruce having to make peace with his past and what happened to his previous young partners, something that drives Bruce to keep Terry at a distance. Also, a good chunk of the film revolves around flashbacks to Batman the Animated Series era, featuring the last adventure of the old Batman family in the DCAU. So I think that's enough to make this a Batman story, even if Terry McGinnis is also a major part of this as well. And really, anytime you get Kevin Conroy as Bruce and Mark Hamill as the Joker, you're in for a good time. Mike, did you have any thoughts on this one before we do the deep dive?
Sure. I must also admit to not really having gotten into Batman Beyond initially. And truth be told, while I have no issues with the show or the comics, I'm not a huge fan even now, although I do like it. But really, if I'm honest, I mostly like the opening episodes of the series, especially those first two episodes that deal with Terry's origin and how he gets connected to Bruce. But my all time favorite Batman Beyond story has been The Return of the Joker. I mean, if you want to pull me into the idea of a next generation Batman, then bringing back the Joker in a clever way is certainly how you do it. I like this story because it does not feel forced or labored. It establishes itself well and has a couple of moments in it that can get to you if you're a fan of these characters. But I'm sure we'll get into that soon enough.
Indeed, we will. We see on early on that Terry McGinnis has made some strides in becoming Batman, but he still has a long way to go until he's ready. He can clobber low rent thugs like the Joker's gang, but he still hasn't triumphed over anyone that you could call a major villain. He hasn't faced that test yet, and to be honest, nobody would want to. It's clear that Bruce and even Barbara know that Terry is still untested because they're clearly trying to protect Terry whenever the subject of the Joker comes up. Some of this is designed to set up the mystery, but it does make sense given how traumatized these surviving Bat family members are. The Joker is an old wound nobody wants to reopen, and with good reason. That's the kind of struggle that can even make you better if you can get through the hell it takes to do it, but it could also break you completely. I was able to see both sides of that argument. Terry has chosen this life and he wants to face that test, but he doesn't know what that might cost him.
You know, referring to the Joker as some garden variety wacko who threatened people with whoopee cushions and squirting flowers is a prime example of just how far Terry had to go. A little bit of research would have revealed the atrocities he has committed and the graveyards he has filled. The fact that Bruce doesn't even want him to go there and never even talked about the Joker should have been a red flag that perhaps some caution was needed there, especially after Barbara told him the same thing. But he does come around at the end, as I think Bruce himself noticed. He makes Batman his own by learning from the original while doing things his way. Like how Bruce told him that the Joker was going to try and talk to him to distract him, so Terry should block it out and fight his way through it, which worked for Bruce. But Terry is his own Batman by the end of the film and takes what he has learned and goes a different direction, effectively, I might add. The Return of the Joker is really where Terry becomes his own Batman.
I think so too. And I think this story is where Terry proves he can operate on that level, both to Bruce and to himself. I like that the writers really put some thought into how the Joker came back as well. They knew that they could have brought him back in dozens of ways, given the sheer number of sci fi tropes that they have at their fingertips. They could have just cloned him or put him on ice and called it a day. But I got the feeling they really didn't want to do the obvious thing. And they set the method of Joker's return as part of the film's big mystery. That just really worked for me.
I appreciated that as well. I thought how they brought the Joker back was really pretty clever. The first time I watched it, I thought Tim Drake might be involved because of his career, but I in no way suspected that the Joker was using him for a timeshare. But once it happened, it all fell into place so perfectly. They used that one event in the past as a catalyst for the whole movie, like a ripple across the surface of all their lives, even the Joker's. Really, I think the whole movie is pretty tight as far as the writing goes. How they did this made the Return of the Joker one of my favorite Joker stories. Plus, I do love the obvious Captain America reference by Terry McGinnis, though, where he was going through the possibilities of how the Joker could have come back with the suspended animation due to floating around in a block of ice or something.
Absolutely. The other thing that really works is how Joker sells himself as the arch villain of the movie. I mean, you have Mark Hamill, and that's enough to sell you on the fact that it's the Joker and he's really back. Not to mention that even Terry's regular bad guys are utterly shocked by how evil the real Joker is. They don't understand what they're dealing with any more than Terry does. And when Joker kills that one henchman for questioning him, there's no question that it's him. He goes from comical to frightening within an instant. That was a great establishing scene, and Mark Hamill's so good at chewing the scenery.
Actually, if I could build on that a little, it was a great establishing scene, but for more than just what you mentioned, I think. I really thought the scene showed Joker's skill as a leader. Leading criminal organizations or gangs is not the same as leading a group of heroes. There are entirely different tactics involved and factors to consider. It's like the differences between Starfleet and the Terran Empire and the Mirrorverse. The Joker keeps his men guessing, like you said. He goes from comical to frightening in an incident. This is important because in his situation, comfortability in the gang is the enemy. He is firm with his decisions and he does not take less than what he ordered. Next, he kills the only one who is comfortable enough to challenge him, thus discouraging any other challenges.
That's a point that's well taken. The Joker's gang are not a well organized group, let's face it. I mean, they're generally a bunch of two-bit thugs and they don't have understand how a criminal organization really works. So when the Joker shows up, he completely dominates the entire gang and he gives a clear lesson in the prices of defiance. From there, he makes them a much more organized and dangerous group. Another thing I like about Return of the Joker is that this movie doesn't use Joker in the same old tired formula. One of my huge pet peeves with him is the recycled plot of escape from Arkham, do horrible thing, Batman beats Joker to a pulp, decides to throw Joker back in Arkham, rinse, repeat. That is thankfully not the case in this film. In this movie, the Joker has an agenda and an actual plan, and it very nearly works at first. You can tell that the Joker has been moving pieces on the board in the background, from Bruce's rival at Wayne Enterprises to the Death Ray satellite, and the way that he uses the Joker gang. But I think where Joker gets a near total victory is when he sends the Joker gang to attack Terry at the dance club, and it's all to distract Terry while Joker attacks Bruce directly. Joker very nearly kills Bruce with Joker Venom, and it very nearly works except for two things: Bruce developing an anti Venom at the time of the attack, and Terry disobeying orders and coming to the manor to save Bruce. This was an instance where Bruce keeping Carrie at a distance to protect him very nearly killed him, and Joker would have anticipated that. Joker just misjudged and underestimated Terry, and that's the reason the plan ultimately fails. But this is probably as close as I've seen to the Joker actually killing Bruce. When the Joker makes his move in this film, it's usually hardcore. He is not playing his usual games anymore, and the movie is better for it. But what did you think about how Joker was written in this film?
Overall, I think he was written well. It felt a bit out of character to have such a long reaching and widespread plan like the Joker did. In my experience with the Joker, his plans can be intricate and well thought out, but they are short lived. I am far from a Joker expert, but I can see the whole thing with Tim Drake happening and Joker and Harley turning him into JJ all just to fuck with Batman. But the thing with the DNA chip and taking over Tim's body later feels like it's out of character. I mean, in the comics, the Joker tells Jason Todd that he had, in fact, orchestrated all of the horrible things that had happened to Jason just until he became Red Hood, which would require some extremely long planning and some foresight of the future. But that was obviously all a lie to fuck with Jason. That's not something he would actually do. I mean, don't get me wrong. As I said earlier, I thought it was a brilliant way to go about it. That is just not something the Joker of my personal headcanon would do. Another thing that goes against my headcanon, is the Joker truly hating Batman's guts. I don't think that that's true, as I talked about in our Dark Knight Returns talk earlier. It is a dark, twisted, evil love, but I believe Joker loves Batman. As far as him almost killing Bruce, that moment hit me really hard. When Terry first turned over Bruce and I saw him with the Joker smile, my heart stopped for a second. I was straight freaking out for like a solid 30 seconds there. That was quite a scene.
Yes, it was. But to answer your question, I guess it depends on which Joker we're talking about. I can't help but think that this is a clown at midnight situation where Joker just reinvents himself completely from time to time. Some versions of Joker can form long range plans, like the criminal from the Three Jokers. Though I do agree that the typical Joker that we see wouldn't normally act that way. But I think the easiest explanation is to say that the Joker is tapping into Tim's knowledge and ability somehow, and that's why he's able to do the things we see him do in this movie.
Actually, either of those explanations totally work. But I really like that bit about tapping into Tim's knowledge and abilities. I think that very nicely fits into the story. So I'm going to head and go with that. But you had something more to say about Tim Drake, didn't you?
Yeah, I do. Honestly, I'm really torn about what happens to Tim in this movie. Tim Drake is one of my favorite Robins, and what happens to him in this movie just hurts to watch. On the one hand, I have to admit it raises the creep factor of the Joker to a completely new level, and it is both in character and sadly typical of the kind of damage that Joker does to the various Robins. I mean, sure, this is the guy who killed Jason, and that left a huge scar on Bruce. But in this film, we see that the Joker, in many ways, is worse than the Robin that he didn't kill. Tim in the comics was often haunted by the memory of Jason, knowing what a weight that his death had on Bruce, and always wondering if he was a step away from sharing Jason's fate. But I think what Joker does to Tim is honestly worse than anything he ever did to Jason, and it traumatizes not just Tim, but Bruce and Babs as well. The arc of the entire film from Bruce's perspective is letting go of the pain and the guilt he feels for having failed Tim and not letting that get in the way of training Terry. So while it hurts to see this happen to Tim, I understand why this was necessary for Bruce, Babs, and Terry in their respective stories.
Did did you notice that they removed Jason Todd entirely and said that Tim Drake took over when Nightwing had gone off on his own to another city? Well, while they rewrote what happened, they basically put Tim in Jason's shoes as far as the effect that events with the Joker had on Batman and the Bat family. But as far as what happened to Tim Drake, that must have felt like the ultimate violation of self. To actually have your physical body changed and your mind altered so that you are not in control of your body is a terrifying concept. I don't know about you, but with how Tim was able to fight off the Joker's order to kill Bruce, I got the sunken place feel out of the whole thing. If you don't know what that is, I'm referencing Jordan Peele's Get Out from 2017, and it's a place of darkness inside yourself where you are kind of watching and hearing what is going on, and it is always something bad, but you can't interact. Sunken inside yourself, you are merely an observer, is how I would describe what is going on with Tim Drake there. And honestly, after weeks of torture, I can imagine myself in a state similar to being in the sunken place, having to retreat inside myself to escape what is happening. That would not be an experience one could just get better from. As Tim described, it took a really long time, and it would cause psychological damage. Of course, this gets a bit more intense as Joker has taken over Tim on a biological level too. In every way imaginable, Tim was violated. What is sick is that it was all to get to Batman, who, knowing all that I just described, is traumatized watching someone he loves, that it was under his guard, that was just a boy to go through that.
I really am going to have to watch Jordan Peele's films one of these days. Anyway, I do agree with all that, and I think it shows how monstrous Joker is in this film, and it sells the tragedy of Tim and the DCAU. As for Jason Todd and the Red Hood, he actually was introduced recently in the Batman the animated series spinoff comic that was done in the last few years. I wish we'd seen him in the animated series while it was on, but I digress. Anyway, I enjoyed the final showdown between Terry and Joker in the end of the movie. Terry starts earning his Batman stripes by embracing what he brings to the table rather than trying to imitate Bruce. Like Spidey, Terry is someone who can quip with the best of them, and I like that Terry tries to get an advantage by hurling insults at the Joker. I also dig that he uses the fact that Joker sees Terry as beneath him against him. These are really good tactics to use. And watching the Joker be on the receiving end of his own tricks is so satisfying to watch. So when Terry finally gets his victory against the Joker, it feels earned. And that's what you really want when you're dealing with a legacy hero who's trying to prove himself.
It was a very satisfying ending, with the exception of the few minor things that may only just be me that I mentioned earlier about the Joker's character. I also like the Spider Man comparison to Batman Beyond. I think Terry has a bit more of an edge to him, but otherwise, that's a pretty spot on take, I think. As I mentioned earlier, he really becomes his own Batman in this film. But that about wraps up our top five Batman animated films discussion. The only thing we have left is a couple honorable mentions that we were discussed but did not make our list. So why don't you start us off with the honorable mention section, Steve?
Sure, I'd be glad to. I know that we had some trouble agreeing on a list at first, at least beyond Year One and Mask of the Phantasm. So our initial lists were very different, but here's our chance to shout out a couple of other films that didn't quite make it, but are still worth bringing up. So, Mike, did you want to start us off?
Sure. My honorable mention is 2004 Son of Batman, based on the 2006 Batman and Son by Grant Morrison in Batman 655 through 658. If you have not read those, I recommend them, or the Batman and Son trade as they are collected in. There are things that are different about the movie, and they are largely because this film is based in the New 52 universe. For instance, in the comics, Damian was born of Bruce and Talia's DNA spliced together in a petri dish. But here they call back to a pre-New 52 comic where Talia drugged and seduced Batman as to how Damian was born. I believe my friend Steve here can attest to their quality. Did you want to say anything about that before we get into the film, Steve?
Oh yeah, I'm a huge fan of the Grant Morrison run, and Damien as a character I like a lot, so I was interested in this film, and I definitely recommend you read those books, especially Batman and Robin with Dick and Damien. Anyway, where Son of Batman really works is Damien himself because he's written exactly as he should be. His relationship with Bruce is easily the strongest point of the movie to me, and where they focus on that, I enjoy the film quite a lot. I also like the brief Nightwing and Damien interaction that we get. It's not as much as I would like, but I love them together more than I like Damien with Bruce, and it's nice to see that. Where I enjoyed it less was the portrayal of Deathstroke and the way the film hits some of my pet peeves when it comes to Slade Wilson. I'm a huge fan of Deathstroke in the comics, especially in New Teen Titans and the Christopher Priest run on Deathstroke. But here it just seems like Slade was kind of rewritten to fit what the movie needed him to be, rather than reflecting who he is in the comics, and that kind of annoyed me a little. I can forgive changing his backstory a little bit to make him the Raish's successor if they do it right. But one thing kind of bothered me more. How do you have Nightwing and Deathstroke in the same movie and not have the two of them fight? The two of them are long-standing arch enemies going all the way back to the Teen Titans, and it is never brought up once. This is like having Lex Luthor as your main villain and bringing in Superman as a walk-on character. I get that the story is about Damian trying to overcome his upbringing and becoming truly his father's son, and that's fine. There are ways that they could have done that, and I feel like Damian's arc was good. But DC features have this annoying habit of diminishing Nightwing when he should be more important, and also trying to push Deathstroke as a Batman villain over his long-standing rivalry with Dick Grayson. So I just wasn't a fan of those things. Still, I think the overall package is overall enjoyable enough that I was able to appreciate this film, even if it does things that I disagree with. I mean, the Bruce Damian relationship is the core of this movie, and that really works enough to get me past my other issues.
I think maybe we differ here because you are a much bigger Nightwing fan than I am and have a
Hmm.
much longer history with the character. Also, I have only read the New 52 and a little bit of the Rebirth Teen Titans. I think that allowed me to be more accepting of the differences there. I mentioned in the Suicide Squad episode that Deadshot is my go-to assassin in comics. But with all honesty, I think Deadshot can be taken out by my second favorite assassin in comic, and that is Deathstroke the Terminator. I am such a huge Deathstroke fan, in fact, that I even own a Deathstroke mask. And while I am on the subject, if you haven't watched the animated Deathstroke film, Knights and Dragons, you are missing out. But my point in bringing him up is that his appearance in my first honorable mention, Son of Batman, is one of the reasons I like the film so much. The other reason is that I'm a huge Damian fan. He can be insufferable and arrogant, but he has off the charts skill and IQ at an age where there is not enough life experience to provide humility. So I can forgive that. He is my favorite Robin because of his off the charts training and education. That kid has doctorate level knowledge of a lot of stuff, and he was clearly classically educated as well. I think Damian, more than other Robins, is more qualified for the position of Robin for that reason. You add to this that he is Bruce Wayne and Talia al Ghul's son, and for me, the case is just closed. But in the Son of Batman movie, you get to see two of my favorite characters pitted against each other in a bitter rivalry, and I really like that they let Damian solve that on his own, and that he chose to be Robin, the son of Batman, at the end of the fight. While I do like Deathstroke's original origin in the comics, I do like how they set it up here, and that Damian takes out his eye. As far as Batman goes in the film, I liked Bruce's approach to Damian. Batman pointed in the right direction and even had to draw some hard lines, but it felt more like giving Damian a flashlight to lead him out of the darkness. The League of Assassins and Talia had taught Damian to be lethal on his own, a one-man army if need be. He was taught to need no one and to be self-reliant, but Damian respects Batman because his mother and grandfather do. So when Batman teaches him another way, he listens. He questions, but he listens. And by the end, he has chosen to pursue his father's way. The reason Son of Batman did not make this list, because while it is very good, those that made the top 5 on this list are great, in my opinion. Had this been a top 10 list, it would have made the cut for sure. But what was your first honorable mention, Steve?
That's fair. Before I get into that, I will second the recommendation on Deathstroke, Knights and Dragons. While it's not a perfect film, they got the Marv Wolfman origin of Slade down pretty well, even if the Titans were written out of it. That movie also understood the core of Slade as a character. He is the world's greatest assassin and the world's worst father. Definitely check that one out if you're a Deathstroke fan. But this is a Batman list, not a Deathstroke list, so let's move on to the honorable mentions. For my honorable mention, I want to shout out Batman Soul of the Dragon. And honestly, a large part of that is the writing of Jeremy Adams. If you're a fan of the current run on The Flash, which, by the way, has been incredible so far, it is the same person who wrote this film. Soul of the Dragon is very much a love letter to the comics and the films of the 70s, and it references things like Shaw Brothers films, Bruce Lee films, and elements of 70s Batman comics. Honestly, I never thought I'd ever see Silver St. Cloud from Steve Englehart's Batman run in a DC film, but she makes it a brief appearance here, and she's great in the little time she gets. But most of all, Soul of the Dragon goes hardcore in the martial arts world of the DC universe, focusing on Richard Dragon, Lady Shiva, and the Bronze Tiger, who we talked about in our Suicide Squad episode.
You are spot on with Soul of the Dragon being a love letter to that time period, not just in movies, but in Batman comics too. Writer Jeremy Adams cites the 1970s Batman comics, specifically those written by Denny O'Neil, as an influence on the tale, saying the 1970s were a unique time. You have the Kung Fu craze, James Bond movies, and satanic cult movies. So there's like this great cross section, and they all lived in the same time in the 1970s, and it was a great place to put this. Not to mention, it's one of Batman's seminal ages. So that's definitely what Adams was going for. But it would seem that Adams drew a lot from a specific Bruce Lee film, 1973's Enter the Dragon. There are several homages to Bruce Lee's Enter the Dragon. The soundtrack on the opening credits is a different take, yet overtly reminiscent of the opening credits in Enter the Dragon. Other characters are direct references to the film, such as in the comics, Richard Dragon is depicted as white, but in the film, the film makes him Chinese, and he is specifically designed to resemble Bruce Lee himself. Ben Turner is designed to resemble Jim Kelly's Williams character from Enter the Dragon. The blonde challenger with the mustache that Sheba fights was modeled after Chuck Norris. And last but not least, O-sensei's design is based on Master Po from 1972's Kung Fu. But I believe you had an abridged story synopsis for us, don't you, Steve?
I do, but I want to address first a couple of things that you brought up. I was initially thrown by the change to Richard Dragon, but then I realized what Jeremy Adams was doing. The way Richard is animated echoes Bruce Lee's moves, and I saw definite references to Fist of Fury, which is one of my favorite Bruce Lee films. There's one point where he does the beckoning gesture from Fist of Fury, and I think Richard Dragon even does the move where Bruce Lee kills the chef in one blow, and it's awesome. I'll add that Bruce Lee in Fist of Fury is a very Batman-like character at times, so I love those references. But honestly, I just love the idea of Richard Dragon as a martial arts super spy. That was a really cool interpretation of him, and it kind of was a nod to the '70s James Bond films. I can definitely see the Enter the Dragon connection, though. That movie is a definitive Bruce Lee film, and it influenced things like Mortal Kombat. As for Bronze Tiger, I initially was thinking Kareem Abdul-Jabbar from the Game of Death, since Jabbar was also a student of Bruce Lee as well as Chuck Norris. But Jim Kelly works too. There are also elements of classic blaxploitation characters like Shaft with Bronze Tiger as well. But let's get into the plot. The basic idea of this movie is that the Cobra cult is trying to open a magical gateway to a hell dimension to acquire godlike power. The only ones who can stop them are the students of the O-sensei, Batman, Richard Dragon, Bronze Tiger, and Shiva Wusan. There are brief flashbacks that run in and out of the story, all establishing who these people were under the O-sensei's tutelage in Nanda Parbat. We see these characters change over time, both from the past to the present, but also in the present as they face down Cobra. And it keeps the flavor of a '70s film really well. If you like some of Quentin Tarantino's '70s homages in films like Kill Bill, it feels a lot like that, but not in a way where they're trying to intentionally copy it. It's a really nice tribute to '70s Batman in the films of the time. Also, James Hong from Big Trouble in Little China plays the O-sensei, and that is absolutely perfect casting to me. This movie is a lot of fun, and as a fan of the '70s Batman, I really appreciate what they did with this movie.
I think I did too, but not quite as much as you. But I will get into why in just a second. You mentioned liking James Hong as O-sensei, and I have to agree with that. I will also add that I really liked Michael Jai White as Bronze Tiger too.
Mm.
Maybe it's because I know who White is, but he really sold that Ben Turner role for me. As far as why you might have liked it more, I'll be honest, back when I was a kid, we really didn't watch too many martial arts movies beyond the occasional Bruce Lee movie. Like I saw Enter the Dragon, for instance. But my dad has said that he really only needed to know that the characters were fighting and didn't much care about the actual fight. So I am actually more familiar with the genre because of watching some of those films as an adult and learning about their influence on Tarantino's work, especially in Kill Bill. So I feel like I might be missing out on some of the nostalgia for this style of film. But that said, I really liked it. In fact, I noticed that there was more effort put into the fight choreography for Soul of the Dragon. In many animated films, it feels like the fight choreography is an afterthought. But that wasn't the case with Soul of the Dragon. As a former martial artist, I really appreciated the attention to detail. All in all, it's a pretty solid film.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's true that this movie definitely hits better if you're in on the joke. I didn't see a lot of Bruce Lee films until a bit later in life, but after I did, I just grew to love them. So I was able to enjoy what this film was able to do with Richard Dragon. I've also read a fair amount of '70s Batman, including a good chunk of the Denny O'Neil and Steve Englehart stuff that Adams is referencing, and that might also make a difference. But as our picks make clear, there are Batman films for every kind of fan, and not every film is going to land perfectly for everyone.
There certainly are a variety of takes on Batman, and that I think offer at least one interpretation that would work for almost anyone in the DCAU. I also have to touch on something real quick that I mentioned earlier, but cannot elaborate on without spoiling which movies made the list. That one thing is that my man Steve here is really not a Joker fan, as he mentioned earlier. So the fact that 4 out of the 5 movies on our top 5 list have the Joker in them, but are done in such a way that even a guy who does not like the character was able to appreciate his role in the film says a lot. When used correctly, the Joker can make a great film, and these 5 films we chose are examples of how using the Joker is done right. Not that he can't ever be the main villain. Death in the Family was amazing, for instance. But that should be the rarity and not the standard. And I think that even though Steve and I disagree about the Joker, we can both agree on that.
Yeah, we definitely can agree on that for sure. It goes to show how much is in the execution and not necessarily in the character himself. I mean, in several of these films, Joker was used as a mild seasoning rather than being the focus of the story, and that made a big difference in those films. And in the one instance where Joker was the focus, they found a different approach to the formula. So with all of these films, Joker is around just enough to fulfill his purpose without overstaying his welcome, and I dig that. But I think this wraps up our discussion of our favorite Batman animated films. These lists are always subjective, and I'm sure our audience may well feel that a favorite movie was left off of it. So if you do, please let us know what Batman movies make your cut and what we should have included instead. Still, it was fun discussing these films with Mike, and I know I've gained a new appreciation for some of them. So until next time, thanks to everyone for tuning in, and as always, thanks to our patrons for making this podcast possible.